Well, we'll make a start now. Our speaker today, Avgi Saketopoulou, is a queer Cypriot in New York, where she has a private practice as a psychoanalyst and is a faculty member of the NYU postdoctoral program in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. Her Sexuality Beyond Consent was published last year to wide acclaim. It offers, among much else, the most significant account of the radical potential of polymorphous perversity since Marcuse's Eros and Civilization. The Red Clinic is honoured to be the chosen host today of an extension of a key theme of her work, not least because of its anti-capitalist thrust. Joining Avgi today as respondents are Lisa Duggan, in her words, pinko commie queer writer and professor of social and cultural analysis at NYU, Noelle McAfee, professor of philosophy at Emory University with a secondary appointment as professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences, and Lara Shiha, assistant professor of clinical psychology at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. I'll put links in the chat to details of past and upcoming works by the members of our esteemed panel. We have 3 hours, which will give us plenty of time to hear from Avgi and her respondents, as well as from you. So please post comments and questions in the chat, and you'll be welcome to speak on camera as well. Please note that this event is being recorded, so please do not make recordings of your own. We will make the recording available afterwards. Thank you. Over to you, Avgi.
Hello, everyone. Many thanks to the Red Clinic for hosting this event and for all your very radical work, Luke. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to discuss my ideas here. The Red Clinic is one of the most radical spaces in psychoanalysis today. And also my deep gratitude to my 3 discussants, each of whom I consider to be an excellent exigent sadist in their own right. And that's why I'm very honored to be in conversation with them today. Lisa Duggan's fierce feminist and queer scholarship needs no introduction, but some of you may not be aware that she's also the person under whose deeply principled presidency the American Studies Association passed its BDS resolution. Noelle McAfee, whose writings about psychoanalysis and politics are fascinating, went viral a few weeks ago when she was arrested at the Emory encampment. A cop asked her to stop filming a student's brutalization, and she replied firmly and simply, no. No, the refusal to take one's place as ordained by state authority is a critical ingredient of exigent sadism. Last, and certainly not least, Lara Shiha has been a formidably powerful voice against Palestinian oppression. Her solo work and her work with Stephen Shiha sadistically uncovers how fantasies of innocence are operated by analytic purveyors of complexity and nuance. I'm just thrilled to be joined by these powerful women for this event today, and thank you all for spending some of your life's precious time with us. I want to start with a poem by the Alexandrian Greek poet Konstantinos Kavafis. The translation is mine, and I'll read it in English, but the Greek and English versions are going to be put in the chat. He who hopes to grow in spirit better rise above obedience and respect. Yes, he will keep to some laws, but if he is to go beyond the straight, inadequate norm, the majority of laws and customs he'll have to transgress. Sensual pleasures will have much to teach him. Mostly, he will not fearfully recoil from the destructive act. Half the house will have to come down. Only thus does anyone who wishes to grow their spirit stand a chance for wisdom. In my book, Sexuality Beyond Consent, I was preoccupied with encounters with opacity, with the tangle between trauma and the erotic, with how it is excess, not calibration, intensity, not regulation, that courts transformative experience. I closed that work by theorizing an ethical variant of sadism that I called exigent, but I stopped short of exploring its political implications and its political uses, which is what I will do today. Exigent sadism is a decidedly psychoanalytical-political concept, and I use this compound term to refuse the cleaving of the psychoanalytic from the political, and also because I'm interested in what happens to each of these terms when they cross-contaminate. I'm offering exigent sadism as a psychoanalytical-political concept then, but also as a call to theoretical arms. If we want theory that will help us navigate hatred and violence, theory that can have an impact in the social world, our theory will need to have some teeth. Discussing Edward Said's disinvitation from the Freud Museum in Vienna in 2001 on account of his being, quote, an engaged Palestinian, unquote, Stephen Shiha described recently theory of the sort I'm presenting today as functioning as the throwing of a stone. I'm using these metaphors of teeth and stones to situate us from the start in the domain of theory that is not just made for thinking, but also for action. Action being something that psychoanalysis only theorizes in clinical technique. Against the psychoanalytic backdrop that has conditioned us to think about repair as the apex of psychic development, and which firmly orients us towards accepting others' reparative gestures, however insincere or hollow they may be, of staying in relation come what may, I have wanted to give us theory that helps us think about emotional divestment, even about severing relations, which is what decolonial thinking also requires to have as a resource. My talk today wants to make words do things they don't want to do, to think of sadism as a risk worth taking, but also as a form of care, and to think of repair as a dodge. Both have parts of a larger project I've been working on of proposing new and queer foundations, and I'm using the word queer not as kind of like a different word for gay or trans, but in speaking about retaining the footing in the deviance from the norm that characterizes infantile sexuality in Freud and Laplanche. I want to offer theory today that gives us reasons to say yes to life, but which also helps us see why some say yes to death. Theory that does not turn away from trauma or ugliness. Theory that is itself traumatophilic in that it doesn't try to make trauma disappear. Theory that can bear the weight of acknowledging that harm, death, rupture, negation are all part of life, which is a different thing than saying that they're fair. To explore the vicissitudes of sadism, I will put Laplanche to the test of Fred Moten and pressure him through the Marquis de Sade and Georges Bataille, to delve into a form of sadism that is not destructive but ethical and exigent, and which stands to grow our spirit. And by spirit here, I mean revolutionary spirit. I will suggest that psychoanalysis is taboo on severing relationships, its fetishization of dialogue, however stale or non-dialogic it may be, and it often is. The health-conferring prestige of staying in relation with individuals, groups, or institutions come what may, not only keeps us hostage to situations that harm us, it also works to pacify and quell the insurgent potential of the sexual drive. To resist these, we will need theory that helps us reflect on the transgression of these taboos, even on daring how to break them. Contrary to the transgression of a sexual taboo, however, which is operated by the thrill of danger and pleasure, this transgression produces feelings of pain and loss, and that makes breaking these taboos onerous and eagerly avoided. Breaking them is also costly to us, even as it may also produce a measure of pleasure. This, by the way, is one of the paradoxes of the sexual drive's operations, that its presence in our lives costs us something to which we remain recalcitrantly ambivalent. Transgressing this taboo, in other words, is not something that somebody does willingly, but something that somebody has to almost force on one's own ego, to bend one's will, as the ego will always be reluctant to encounter anything that disturbs its equilibrium. Even a bad but stable situation can be preferable to the ego, so to break this taboo, other forces that are disloyal to the ego, and which are undeterred by the dysregulation brought about by transgression, will have to be summoned. That force, I will propose, draws on the sovereignty of the sexual drive, which is one reason we'll turn to Sade and his idea of sovereignty as read through Bataille. Sade is one of our most insistent and persuasive authors on how the erotic and politics entwine. His work dares a vertiginous line into the abyss, giving us a way to think about the dangers of desexualization. To suggest that there's something dangerous in desexualization may seem startling, and all the more so in connection to Sade, whose reputation as a depraved libertine precedes him. But Sade's thinking puts pressure on psychoanalysis's most cherished concepts, reparation, to illuminate how the reparative can easily substitute for justice. It is from him that I first learned that turning away from the sovereignty of eroticism, which is, again, a different use of sovereignty to which I'll turn shortly, prepares the ground for the substitution of justice for the reparative. So I'll track how critical desexualization is to the reparative impulse and why that's a problem that should concern us. For now, briefly, it is no accident that the principal theorist of repair, Melanie Klein, works with a form of aggression that is entirely cleaved from sexuality. Both from within and from without psychoanalysis, the reparative nowadays operates as a propaganda for a form of living where injustice is not something we suffer and may fight against, but something to come to terms with and learn to live with. The reparative, to put it differently, is part of the ideological apparatus within psychoanalysis that conditions us to accept our circumstance, working to generate and systematize an acquiescent passivity to injustice and harm. And I find that Jessica Benjamin's work specifically suffers from this problem and has kind of like burgeoned this problem in psychoanalytic thinking. Another reason why I turned to Sade is that he's insistent on critiquing the idea that forging stable societal structures requires the repression of our animal instincts and therefore of our libidinality. For him, this coerced repression sets the stage for how we're disciplined by the state. Historically speaking, the undisciplined has always been seen as posing a threat to reason and to social order. Western political philosophy has largely treated embodied passions as needing to be tamed, thereby ejecting from the social tableau of political life anything resembling the anarchy of the sexual drive. The fact that the renunciation of the drives is seen as the premier civilizing gesture builds into psychoanalytic theorizing a fearful attitude towards the drive that remains prominent to this day. Let us remember then that libidinal taming is nothing less than a safeguarding against life itself, extinguishing the appetite for life. What Nathalie Salzman, the French analyst, calls, quote, a taste for life, which she describes as being precarious, points us to how being alive and well adapted is starkly different than being psychically alive. From Greek philosophers to Rousseau's social contract theory, political theory has persistently remanded the sexual to the domain of privatized erotic relationships. To be moved away from a selfish focus on ourselves to external objects, to the pursuit of knowledge, to participation in political life, etc., requires for most of them abolishing the distractive potential of sexuality and the body's hedonism. This exaggerated optimism about a de-sexualized civilization and the enthusiasm for progress about which Freud was enduringly ambivalent have plunged us into a faith in rationality. And I would argue that much of psychoanalytic thinking today, while touting its attunement to the irrational, is actually devoted to eliminating the irrationality of the unconscious that this very same theory has also argued is ineliminable. It is to this incessantly grinding wheel of rational optimism that psychoanalysis has harnessed the hope that dialogue, cooperation, and repair can master the wildness of the drive. In Sexuality Beyond Consent, I argued that repair is operated by the fantasy that we can be cured of our sexual unconscious and of our wounds if only we drag them out of the shadows and into the light of consciousness. We know from the clinic that this is not true, that ghosts that haunt us never quite fully get turned into benign and inert ancestors. But my attention today is pitched towards another problem with reparation, namely that it works to dampen sexual energies that fuel our willingness to act when necessary, and even to break ties with those that want to harm us. By breaking ties, I don't only or even necessarily mean the severing of a relationship, though that should not be taken off the table. I use the term breaking ties in the metapsychological sense of breaking the libidinal ties that bind us to objects, to institutions, and to social contracts that harm us. I'm referring, in other words, to processes of psychic divestment, about which I'll have to say more soon. If we soften our mythical attachments to repair, that is, to the ideological groundwork that works to tether us to those who harm us by denying reality, by wanting to turn us away from what is occurring before our eyes, this ideological groundwork might give way. Underwritten by its conceptual twin, dialogue, repair shouldn't be, but most often is, about making the reality and impact of violence and of harm disappear by dragging it into the molasses of dialogue where it can endlessly and meaningfully repeat. For example, in a recent effort to occupy the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago, the Institute's director, Heidi Heidkamp, who is also a former US Democratic senator, was still in the building. When protesters arrived, she refused to leave, and she said, "I tried to explain that the Institute of Politics is a place for dialogue," unquote. Never mind that she spoke from a building close to the encampment where student protesters had been violently dragged out of by riot police 2 weeks earlier, police that was called, of course, by the university. "We're neutral," Heidkamp added with no hint of irony, quote, "Our role at the university is to really create a space for cross-dialogue," unquote. And to see how repair is instrumentalized, consider the ongoing genocide in Palestine and how those who argue that what is unfolding is not a genocide do so by invoking Israel's actions as being part of a larger effort to repair the wound of anti-Semitism, in effect by supporting a murderous nation state. We begin to see how the reparative lends itself to being used to fuel oppressive conduct. And I describe this use as lending itself because such use is not misuse. As I'll explain, the concept is itself conceptually freighted with the potential for precisely this type of instrumentalization, as it has arisen through legacies that perform precisely this kind of labor. The reparative, to use language from Lara and Stephen Sheehan's work, is not as innocent or ideologically vacant as some psychoanalytic theories would have us think. My hope in raising these points is that if psychoanalysis can become less enchanted with reparation, one might then become more interested in questions of revolutionary responsibility. Let us also note the primacy we have bestowed to how the primacy that we have bestowed to repair consolidates the supposition that relationships need to be preserved no matter what their harm to us. If the other party wants to repair, why would you hurt them by refusing them that option? The question usually goes. If dialogue is the epitome of healthy exchange at the very heart of our democracy, is refusing dialogue not uncivilized? Notice how this question quickly eliminates the fact of your injury, which is now superseded by the feelings of the person who injured you. Note how your hesitation to participate in dialogue, even when that dialogue is a sham, stands to pit you against democratic order itself. What these questions also cultivate is the idea that institutions do or could behave like grown-ups who will take care of us. And think those of us who are in university settings and have been present for the student protests have witnessed firsthand how quickly the university called police on our students precisely under the rubric of repair and protectionism. All these are part of the house that needs to come down. Though to be clear, such demolition is not a rejection of the psychoanalytic project, but an urging to care for it by asking more of it, to fight for it as Adam Phillips, in a phrase from Ada Phillips, as a refuge from the world. For this, we'll have to refuse the degradation of psychoanalysis into a form of instrumental reason, which is what de-sexualizing it produces. By instrumental reason, I'm referring to the widespread stipulation in psychoanalytic thinking today that every unformulated, traumatic, dissociated, or unrepresented experience be symbolized. The demand that parapraxis surrender their motivations, the dreams revealed to us are unconscious, that there where it was, there shall ego be, that the unknown be wholly substituted by knowledge about the self, about the past, about our psychic life. I'm not suggesting that symbolization is unimportant or that the work of understanding or interpretation is to be dismissed. These are critical aspects of clinical work. But I do want to urgently draw our attention to how the reduction of psychoanalysis into hermeneutics, which is a dominant trend today, decays the remarkable and I think unrealized insurgent potential of psychoanalysis. It is precisely in the libidinal that its political potential becomes more radiant. And to be clear, by libidinal, I'm not referring to love or connection, but to a force that encompasses the ferocity, even the brutishness of the sexual drive, of which sadism is a critical component. Sadism is a heavy term, heavy with history, and which calls up tremendous anxiety, and that makes my project of complicating it a very difficult one. My hope today is to advance that project just a little bit further, to interrupt narrow and cliched understandings of sadism, to present sadism to us as an object for thought, to introduce a pause, even a swerve in our habitual ways of seeing it, and to open up the fan of sadisms, plural. Sadisms is a word I've been using in its plural form to mark the plurality of sadism, to draw attention to the fact that sadism is neither a single nor a unitary concept. Different sadisms behave well differently. They're driven by distinct forces. Destructive sadism, which is what we usually mean when using the term, denotes the barbarism of somebody who dispenses pain gratuitously, indifferent to the other's well-being or dignity. The destructive sadist craves cruelty and will stop at nothing until their appetite is satisfied. A different and a more benign form of sadism arises in some BDSM practice. Here, based on consensually negotiated scenarios, one person acts as if they were a sadist while actually practicing self-restraint and respecting preordained limits. In Sexuality Beyond Consent, I call these simulated forms of sadism sensible. Sensible sadism is a defanged variant, which does not conduct sadism's force, and both destructive and sensible sadisms are active forms in that they involve the exercise of the will. The destructive sadist wills themselves over another, while the sensible sadist wills themselves over themselves. In contrast, exigent sadism is operated by passibility, which Jean-François Lyotard described as hovering between activity and passivity, a capacity to endure, even to suffer, akin to what the psychoanalyst Emmanuel Gant meant by surrender. Passibility works to open an interval, disrupting the other's translations, by exploiting an opportunity that was lost to us when Freud moved away from thinking about the more destabilizing and demonic aspects of sexuality. Briefly, by introducing the concept of narcissism, Freud newly equated the sexual with full object love, ceding the more anarchic and disruptive properties, which he had originally described as a key component of infantile sexuality and polymorphous perversity. But designating the sexual as a more pacified and unified domain created a conceptual problem. Where would these now evicted, disunifying properties of the sexual go? Freud tried to solve this problem by positing a new distinctive domain, which he called the death instinct, to house the disturbing elements of the sexual. And of course, didn't quite work. Having separated them into different drives, Freud would then spend the remainder of his life struggling to explicate how the two conjoin. So he came up with erotogenic masochism, how kind of like the two get sutured together through trauma, female masochism, and so on. But my main point around this is that the death drive is not a distinctive force. It is, in Laplanche's language, quote, nothing more than the reestablishment of the undomesticated pole of sexuality, unquote. The sexual and the death drive are one and the same drive, both aspects of an inseparable coalition. Exigent sadism derives from this coalition, returning us to Freud's earliest enlarged conception of sexuality, and may therefore be thought of as an enlarged sadism, a nerveless determination that stops at nothing, which works by unbinding and calling up a force that may feel frightening by virtue of being sexual. Exigent sadism takes its name from Laplanche's notion of exigency, quote, that object that keeps knocking at the door, the other within us, unquote, a force that, quote, impels us but without showing us the way, unquote. It is precisely this exigency that involves the sadist's own passibility, making sadism a vulnerability for the sadist. Now, if this sounds counterintuitive, it's because we're so accustomed to thinking about sadism as a menacing force. What accounts for ethical sadism's distinctive vulnerability is precisely the fact that in following the exigency of the unconscious, one ends up traveling down unexpected paths towards unforeseen and unforeseeable outcomes. But isn't that the path of destructiveness, one might ask? Isn't that what happens when one lets the drive go unchecked, when containment and symbolization have failed? The short answer is no. For the longer answer, let me take you through some Laplanchian basics. For Laplanche, any communication between an adult and a child is compromised by the adult's sexual unconscious. This introduces a disturbance as if there were noise on the communication line, a surcharge of unbound energy proceeding from the adult sexual unconscious. This incursion is inevitable, and it is also normatively traumatic in that it implants something enigmatic, a foreign body that belongs to the adult, on the infant's psychophysiological skin. To cope with the strain of this enigmatic errancy, which he called implantation, the infant reaches for codes that she sources from the adult world, which is inhabited by social mythosymbolic meanings, and uses them to give form to the unbound energy of enigma. Under ideal circumstances, the child combines this idiosyncratically, crafting meanings which, however, are neither lucid renderings of the irritant, that is enigma, nor are they mere deployments of codes. They are deeply personal creations, and this is what Laplanche called translation. The relationship between enigma and translation, in other words, is capricious. It has nothing to do with accuracy or truth. Because enigma is not a concealed meaning, but a persistent indeterminacy, translation pertains to the child's idiomatic effort to convert the described of the enigmatic into a more pacified and docile form. And this is how, in fact, the ego is constituted, through these translational bindings that give form to the incomprehensibility of enigmatic communications. Laplanche thinks, however, that all translational efforts will inevitably partially fail. This is not because of some developmental arrest in the child or some cognitive or emotional insufficiency. It is because enigma is an ontological impasse. And as such, an untranslated remainder always lingers. This gets repressed, instituting the child's sexual unconscious, which for Laplanche is always already sexual in the enlarged sense of infantile sexuality. The unconscious is foreclosed from this system of representational meanings, not because we have not yet cracked the code of its messaging, but because it is an enduring opacity and always otherwise, an ineliminable dimension in everything. This absence of form is not chaos, but because it is in essence unbound energy, it is energetically anarchic. The repressed thus is not inert, it exerts a force, and that force is what Laplanche will call the sexual drive. Said differently, the sexual drive is not about this or that motivation to have sex or an orgasm, whatever. It is about the pressure that is exerted by the unbound energy of failed translation. This idea that the unconscious is constituted through the failure of translation is central to Laplanchian theory and was also central in Freud. But to me, this feels like a very partial view, partial to the ego's perspective. Why? Because it is only from the ego's viewpoint that the inability to fully transform the disquiet of enigma into something that is meaningful could be seen as a failure. That is, the fact that the ego cannot totalize the foreignness of enigma may only be seen as a problem from the ego's viewpoint. Indeed, from the angle of an ego that has made it its job to dissipate the disturbance of the enigmatic, the very existence of the unconscious is but the outcome of a botched operation. What if we looked at this from another viewpoint? From the unconscious perspective, it is the ego's inability to tolerate this internal foreignness that may be more problematic. From that angle, an overactive ego looks more like, quote, and this is a quote from Laplanche, having the compulsion to synthesize, unquote. What if instead of failure, we thought with Fred Moten's notion of fugitivity? Fugitivity for Moten, quote, is a desire for in a spirit of escape and transgression of the proper and the proposed. It is a desire for the outside, for a playing of being outside, an outlaw edge, unquote. The untranslated may then look different, as an escape from the centripetally organizing forces of our ego. We might thus conceive of that which cannot be psychically ordered, not as a failure, which is the ego's angle, but as an insubordinate wildness that will always evade capture. The ego, of course, would always prefer to flatten enigma's perturbation. It will always want to annex the enigmatic into its territories. But it is precisely because of enigma's insubordinate fugitivity that anything manages to escape at all the ego's despotic command over what is centrifugal in psychic life. So while, yes, the fugitivity of the unconscious, its anarchic and untamable force poses a problem for the ego, that same quality also guarantees that it will always be possible, should conditions arise, for a translation to be undone later, to be detranslated, to be retranslated again in the après coup, which is what psychic transformation actually entails. It is precisely that mechanism, in fact, that makes psychic energy not a constant, but an abundant, ever-renewable energy, because each detranslation, each unbinding produces new psychic energy. But for that to happen, this is a quote from Laplanche, quote, a preliminary scouring, a scraping away of the existing translations has to take place, unquote. I've elsewhere described this experience as overwhelm, the breaking down of an ego, and it is here that I situate exigent sadism. Fugitivity accounts for the ubiquitously relentless effusions of the libidinal, which meet here in a movement of what Bataille described as pure expenditure, a movement that does not follow the logic of conservation, but the impulse for escalation, what I have elsewhere called the more and more of experience. If fugitivity, as Marquis Bay, to use a phrase from Marquis Bay, might be seen as, quote, an inexhaustible agility, unquote, the so-called failure of translation may be thought of as a resistance to being disciplined out of the chaotic and into the orderly. But let us be careful here, because this is not a resistance that is mounted by a centered subject. Remember, we're still in the domain of the unconscious and thus of decenteredness. Fugitivity's libidinality, that is, does not sponsor experiences of concentrated opposition to this idea or that ideology. It potentiates instead the surfacing of disruption and a form of dispossession. To be in dispossession of oneself, Moten writes, quote, is to embrace the privilege of being sentenced to the gift of constant escape, unquote. From this angle, translational failure may be seen as a lush fallout that opens us up to our dispossession. As someone who grew up in a post-colonial country and under occupation, I'm well aware that the term dispossession is also used to mark the action of depriving somebody of land, property, or other possessions. So dispossession is something that we worry about politically. I'm not oblivious to this tangle of meaning, but I am committed to this word not to lose its distinctiveness, but to complicate it. And by joining theorists like Moten and Bataille, who find in dispossession not compromised by something else, to see what else we can do with it. What is that something else? In Bataillean terms, fugitivity might pertain to, quote, a quantity of energy that does not go into work, unquote, resisting the labor demanded by binding, which makes it unavailable for work and thus for capitalism. To think with fugitivity is to note the ego's compulsion to work to conserve itself, whereas the drive is given to escalation and measureless expenditure, quote, and this is from Bataille, just as if a wound were bleeding away inside us, unquote. The ego, you see, and this is a key part of my paper today, is oriented towards scarcity. It is fearful that its resources will be depleted, and it seeks to economize itself at all costs, to conserve even pernicious relationships and affiliations, lest losing them destabilizes its equilibrium. In stark and destabilizing contrast, the sexual drive works with the principle of abundance, recognizing that psychic energy is an ever-renewable resource and thus can be spent lavishly. This is kind of like, for many of us, this is a very surprising way to think about psychic energy. As for the impersonal force of dispossession, actually, I'm going to skip that. Okay, so let me see how I make this connection then. As for the impersonal force of dispossession, this belongs to the domain of psychic reality. Psychic reality, we might say, has a sovereign quality as opposed to psychological reality. We can talk about this in the Q&A. But sovereignty here should not be misunderstood to refer to an agential center of action or to subjective choice, but as an impersonal and decentered press. And to explore this kind of sovereignty, I'll turn to Sade. The Marquis de Sade was an aristocrat and famous libertine who lived at the time of the French Revolution and spent the majority of his life ferried between prisons and psychiatric institutions. During his prolonged confinements, he authored porno-philosophical novels with dizzying arrays of sexual, murderous, pedophilic, and homicidal delights, as he called them. Informed by the utter selfishness of lust, these delights and the writing of these delights earned him his sulfurous reputation. In Sade's writings, however, libertines often interrupt the main plot with seemingly tangential narrative digressions, diatribes that protest abuses of state and church power, that name property as a crime against the poor, that see wars are serving the interest of ruling tyrants, and argue for abolishing the death penalty. Sade gives us images of sexual brutality that one cannot not look at, inviting the reader into a participatory relationship regarding the voluptuousness and horror of desire. In her landmark essay, Must We Burn Sade?, de Beauvoir wrote that, quote, it is neither as an author nor as a sexual pervert that Sade imposes himself on our attention. Sade's anomalies take on their value by the fact that he develops an immense philosophical system in order to claim them, unquote. For Sade, writes Bataille, quote, all breaks are off, unquote. And it is this that makes Sade the paradigmatic sovereign man. Sovereignty here, however, does not have to be only understood as a ruinous disregard for the other. That would be destructive sadism. What Bataille and de Beauvoir admired in Sade was his capacity, even amid conditions of exceptional confinement, to maintain his sovereignty over his mind, to retain his imaginative capacities despite lengthy incarceration, to use writing to explore the limits of his body. But it is not only Sade's resistance that these scholars appreciated in Sade. Long before Weber's famous analysis of the state's monopoly of legitimate violence, Sade gave us the insight that by naming itself the sole legal purveyor of violence, the state converts violence into something instrumental, giving it the veneer of calculation or necessity. To put it differently, in taking over violence, the state desexualizes it. What this means is that at stake is not only who has the right to violence or the right to authorize violence, but that when it is desexualized, violence becomes instrumental reason. State violence is violence that is then executed not with passion, but with a measure of duty, justified by the rubric of necessity. In disaggregating the sexual from the violent, the state can now more effectively harness the libidinal, directing it into productive projects in the service of labor and capital. This is not to say, as Wendy Brown has noted, that, quote, Western ethos is devoid of sexuality, unquote. It is only to say that desexualization is how the state seeks to narrate and organize its arrangements. State power is actually rife with sexuality's more sublimated version, which she describes as, quote, the sexual ethos of predator and conqueror. Because of its pornographic and blasphemous content, Sade's writings were banned during his lifetime, even as his clandestine books circulated widely and were read feverishly. By the early 20th century, his reputation was at an all-time high. The Surrealists saw Sade as the apostle of sexual liberation, a freethinker, a rebel, a pioneer. But World War II was decisive in the rendering of Sade that has become canonized today. After the Holocaust, Sade was picked up by scholars of totalitarianism who wanted to understand the camps. For Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, as for Lacan, Sadean principles shows us what happens when pure reason, Kantian logic, is taken to the extreme. Rationality, they show us, does not protect us from fascism. Reason, to the contrary, acts as fascism's intensifier. The public opinion on Sade turned. Newly seen as an apologist for the use of brute force, Sade now figured as having anticipated the workings of the Nazi killing machine, methodical, apathetic, and monstrous. As such, what is called sadistic today has little to do with Sade. Sadism has become a synonym for speaking about extreme cruelty and monstrous brutality. It has been collapsed into destructive sadism and has lost the distinctiveness of his pairing it with the sexual, pairing the sexual with the violent. Now, I want to kind of like slow down here and pay attention to how that happens at this particular historical moment, because this is also the historical moment that I will connect to the desexualization of Holocaust discourse. What I mean by this is that while sexual atrocities were very much visited on Jewish people in the camps, there was stripping, bodily inspections, rapes, rights of Aryan manhood involving gang rapes, sexual experimentation, forced sterilization, and forced abortions. Representations of the Holocaust actually orbit around yellow stars, shaved heads, and ghettos, emaciated bodies, and numerical tattoos, firing squads, mass graves, gas chambers, crematoriums. As Eva Fogelman notes in her groundbreaking work, quote, there's a long history of silence around sexual abuse during the Holocaust, unquote. And as the feminist scholar of Holocaust history, Zoe Waxman highlights, quote, even in Nuremberg, no reference was made to rape, unquote. This, as both authors note, is not just omission. And there's a lot of scholarship around this. It's not just these two authors. There's a fact that documented resistance from within Holocaust studies to speaking about sexual violences perpetrated during the Shoah, written out of its history. So how does that square with my earlier point about state power being desexualized? While at times of peace, I mean, we see so much violence in the Shoah and kind of like many genocidal conflicts and atrocities. So while at times of peace, the sexual is taken up by the state to be conducted into capitalism and productivity, what we see at times of war and crisis is that the sexual dimension of politics appears more explicitly. War, writes Wendy Brown, quote, does not sexualize power. It reveals power's sexual dimension because it is an extreme expression of political power, unquote. Said differently, what happens in conditions of war, and I would add in conditions of genocidal bloodshed, is not a sexualization of power, as if power were naturally non-sexual and only becomes malignantly, opportunistically annexed by the erotic under armed conflict. What war does is strip away the sublimated coding to reveal the sexual character of politics. In this context, I've been tracking the multiple sexual violences committed against Palestinian bodies, and I'm aware of the limited attention they're receiving right now. Recent photos warrant comparison to the sexual violences in Abu Ghraib, which, by the way, offered one of the key resources for Jasbir Puar's thinking of the concept of homonationalism. We see that thinking with the sexual is both brutal and potentially generative of a wide swath of conceptual possibilities. So, to return to the erasure of sexual violence from the For Laurence Kahn, quote, "The sexualized crimes of the Holocaust should not for a moment be confused with sexual scenes. They should be seen as the product of contamination of sexual life by trauma," unquote. This, however, kind of like this erasure of sexual violence from dominant representations of the Holocaust period, but also the erasure of the sexual element in these sexual violences, is unlike other representations of large-scale oppressions of a people, such as the Atlantic slave trade and colonialisms, where sexual abuses are actually well integrated into the narratives of violence, where the fetishization and sexual exploitation, for example, of the Black body takes many forms, from lynchings to Emmett Till's murder, which was predicated on a white woman's sexual fantasy. So to return to the erasure of sexual violence from dominant representations of the Holocaust, which, as we saw, conditions the epistemological break in reading Sade, the reason that this matters is because having an unusually desexualized representation of historical trauma means that the sexual is, in stripping the sexual from the narrative, means that the narrative is also stripped of any enigmatic elements. Without an enigmatic surplus, there is no agitating foreign body that might set new possible translations in motion. Desexualization, in other words, takes the wind out of the sail of translation, leaving pure historiography as the only option of recounting the Holocaust. Of course, recording the historical event of the Holocaust is very important, especially in a world when anti-Semitism is on the rise and Holocaust denialism, especially before October 7th, threatened to erase the horrors of World War II. Things have somewhat shifted since then. But it's important to note that what historical records want to do is not just to make histories undeniable and to register them. It's also to settle what happened, to reveal the truth by saying everything. They work, that is, by establishing a knowing relationship to the event. Making history into a causal chain, however, gives too much power to deductive logic's capacity to narrate the present, paving the way for the instrumentalization of history into a form of terror, which is what we see occurring today in relation to how the Holocaust is used to power a genocide. The foreclosing of the possibility of translating the Holocaust anew freezes one's relationship to the Holocaust into a standstill, as if facts through archives and testimony can fully determine or even exhaust how one will relate to the Shoah and what psychic afterlives it is allowed to have. Said differently, lack of translational movement stymies any variation or evolution in the relationship that one might have to the history of the Holocaust. It is this, I would suggest, that confers Holocaust history a singular and exceptional, untouchable character. So it is harder for later generations of Jewish people, as we see happening today, though it's not just later generations, but mostly, to establish different relationships to the trauma of the Holocaust. And if they do, if, for example, the never again dictum comes to be translated not as never again to us, but as never again to anyone, this produces consternation in the older generations. This translational novelty may then be treated as heretical, as treasonous, and in some ways it is, because if no Jewish persons should understand the Holocaust differently, we can see how an anti-Zionist Jewish individual might be seen as suffering from internalized anti-Semitism. At stake with desexualization, then, is the question of what it means to have very different relationships to the event and to the world. And that might help us think psychoanalytically about Holocaust exceptionalism and how that translation of the Holocaust, of the historical fact of the Holocaust, paired with settler and racist ideology, is now deployed as a genocidal force. It is also vital to recall with Sade that desexualization sets the stage for a particular cooptation of violence by the state as being necessary, reasonable, and justified, which is what's happening in the last 8 months. When a narrative of trauma becomes singular, it can acquire a definitive and propulsive force, generating its own resistance to retranslation. It is no accident, then, that part of the resistance that Fogelman and Waxman note to the presence of sexuality in the Shoah is suppressed precisely by reference to, quote, the uniqueness of the Holocaust as an event that holds no comparison, unquote. That's a quote from Waxman. My concern about the Holocaust, about the way Holocaust remembrance may bar new translations, is not unique to the Shoah. I think that Afro-pessimism's approach to Blackness suffers from the same problem. Insofar as it reifies social practices of racism and racial oppression that are in fact historical and therefore contingent, it offers a totalizing account of how anti-Blackness works. On the one hand, like the discourse around the Shoah, Afro-pessimism mercilessly recounts the violences of anti-Black racism, as well it should. But as a similarly desexualized account of racism, Afro-pessimism, just like Holocaust memory, is a static and obstructed discourse. I recognize that describing as obstructed discourses that speak to the ongoing pain of those who have endured unimaginable violences that blister through the present may sound dismissive. So let me be clear that what I'm pointing out is how desexualized accounts produce cemented relationships to history, relationships that admit of no different angles or critique, that can hold no ambivalence, and that have no room for new structures of feeling around the historical event. My argument is that it is precisely this discourse's inability to think about the sexual that causes this problem. Because as we saw with Laplanche, without the sexual, there is no enigma. Without enigma, there's no hanging thread in any translation, no residue that the psyche can pull on to generate something new, no experiential leftover that may be reconfigurable in the après-coup, no stir, no provocation, no fugitive element that the psyche can exploit to craft new embodied emotional and thinking relationships to the past. I'm emphatically, even aggressively stressing the human capacity to translate, detranslate, and retranslate, which is the place from which new relationships to the historical event can proceed that may make the world anew. Take as an example how queer of color critique and Black feminisms have richly engaged the historical archive of anti-Blackness alongside the erotic and queerness in a way that countermands Afro-pessimism's limitation. Consider Darius Scott's work on extravagant objection, Amber Masser's work on sensation and Blackness, Sharon Holland on the erotics of racism, Tavai Nyong'o's concept of Afro-fabulation, Ariane Cruz's thought on interracial pornography. I'm mentioning this list, and this list is very contracted, because I want to show that there are many and varied thinking, emotional, and embodied ways in which one can work with the historical archive without negating it. By mining the historiography of colonization and slavery, these authors, while tending to sexual violence, sexual intimacy, and sexual pleasure, these authors open up a fugitive relationship to history. In so doing, they're not refusing or rewriting the past, but they are pressing to release it from the impasse of singular narratives. Now, I want to turn to another narrative that has long captured psychoanalysis' capacity to imagine and respond to injury, and that is Klein's theory of sadism and reparation. For Klein, I'm going to speak for 15 more minutes. For Klein, sadism is a developmental inevitability related to the primal violence of splitting. The infant sadistic impulses, she writes, are, quote, directed not only against its mother's breast, but also against the inside of her body, scooping it out, devouring the contents, destroying it by every means which sadism can suggest, unquote. Oral sadism becomes urethral, muscular, and eventually anal, generating nightmarish fantasies of Sadean intensity. The infant will eventually become concerned that her omnipotent fantasy has actually damaged the mother whom she attacked in hatred, but whom she also loves and depends upon for her survival. Flooded with guilt, she will make efforts at repair to make good the injuries which, quote, she did in fantasy to the mother and for which she still unconsciously feels very guilty, unquote. By accepting these gifts of reparation, the parent reassures the child that her reparative capacities succeed, solidifying the child's sense of her own goodness in light of her destructiveness. Reparation in the Kleinian model offers what David Eng has described as a psychic roadmap for the preservation of love, positing an implicit norm for how relationality can triumph over instinctual and primitive sadism, namely by extending and accepting reparation. Reparation in this model, and many to come, is a triumph of relationality over sadism, over destructiveness, over the sexual drive. We owe to David Eng's work the important critique of Klein that probes, quote, the psychic limits of reparation, unquote. In his paper, Colonial Object Relations, Eng draws out the fact that the Kleinian infant repairs not out of love for the mother, but because the obliteration of the loved object would leave, quote, the ego without the possibility of attachment and hence destroy the ego as well, unquote. Harming the mother, in other words, makes the infant's life, which is dependent on the mother, precarious. This connects to an unexpected leap that Klein makes and which David Eng notices, a leap to European colonialism, where Klein explicitly aligns the colonial explorer to the infant. As Eng underscores, reparation thereby quite emerges as neither anxiety nor ambivalence towards an injured other, but actually as the disavowal of responsibility in a history of colonial war and violence that preserves and extends life to some while withholding it from others, unquote. Despite its claims to the opposite, in other words, repair is not extended to those harmed, nor is it intended to restore the damage caused to the damaged one. Repair is intended to repair the aggressor, and more specifically, the aggressor's own sense of goodness. And think here, for example, of white fragility. It is precisely this liberal reasoning, the labor it performs in restoring a good liberal object who harmed but is not taken to task over that, but seen as worthy of repair, that Eng draws our attention to. With Eng's intervention, we can discern repair as being a kind of ruse that is operated by the destructive sadism of the person who, despite causing us harm, appears before us with the entitlement that we willingly and eagerly participate in their restoration. Those of us in psychoanalytic institutions are well aware of how these dynamics can play out. Of course, they also play out in the academy and beyond, where harm that is done to candidates of color, or more recently to Arab colleagues and to allies who are trying to speak up about Palestine, does not inaugurate the institution's reckoning and efforts to repair, but in a strange and crazy-making reversal, launches a process in which those who are harmed are treated as if they're harming the institution by refusing it the option to represent itself to itself as good, just as trying hard to please even the most, and also acting as if the candidates who protest too much are hard to please. To put this differently, repair is the ruse of a re-enveloping entrapment that inscribes us anew to the terms of the same unchanged and unjust social contract, using the energies of the oppressed to re-authenticate the structures the oppressed are actually trying to break free from. What happens, though, when the object of aggression refuses to participate in the sacrifice that is demanded of them, refusing the labor of docility in order to restore the self-esteem of the person who harmed them? This, I would say, is the domain of exigent sadism. The refusal to take one's place in the reparative sequence, the refusal of empty reparative gestures, taking the risk of not playing one's preordained role in that sequence. I describe this as a risk because refusing the reparative gesture is not at all easy to do. The reparative has been sold to us as a marker of maturity, as a relational capacity, as an orientation to community, as a denunciation of irrationality and narcissism. To put it more bluntly, the willingness to sacrifice oneself as part of a reparative process is one of psychoanalysis's most potent, moralizing, power-wielding tools. On an individual level, too, it's not at all easy to resist the siren call of repair and of dialogue, even when we sense that ongoing dialogue is a sham or a delaying tactic, even when we sense it may do nothing more than sink us into the quicksand of engaging with an object who's really disinterested in us. Nor is it easy to risk breaking relationships, alienating the object, and endangering, if not relinquishing, whatever access, resources, or privileges come with such affiliation. To do so, one has to push back against the human tendency to relinquish access to material resources and go against one's own ego homeostatic impulse to tuck the problem away, lest things just sort themselves out themselves. The fear of how the pushback will be received, that one will be seen as a troublemaker, that one might lose respect or hard-won positions, all these are examples of how the ego could get dysregulated. To remain in a state of homeostasis rather than accept the violent play of change is no doubt a difficult thing. The deployment of ethical sadism draws on a critical momentum following the exigency of the drive without reserve to do what's necessary. Now, to do so is not the same as letting the drive take over. To the opposite, to allow this to happen requires one to have worked through one's own resistances, one's personal dynamics, to do something that transcends subjective taste, which may even feel distasteful or off-putting, to refuse repair and connection or even offers to access. And in that sense, exigent sadism is more an acceptance than a decision. It proceeds not from the domain of activity, but from that of passibility. Now, I'm not saying this to diminish its force. Exigent sadism has cruelty in it, because the refusal to repair the other requires a certain kind of ruthlessness to be brought to the situation, which is another way of saying, which is another thing that makes the exercise of exigent sadism so made it difficult. And to make matters more complicated, if we're honest with ourselves, that ruthlessness is also accompanied by a feeling of pleasure, and that can make us feel guilty, as if the refusal to repair the other should be solemn and serious, when a measure of joy always accompanies the exercise of our sovereignty. The challenge The challenge to prevailing systems of oppression is often accompanied by a sexual rush that attends the experience of, quote, this is a quote also from Brown, making things happen in the world, of awakening the hidden, denied, sleeping, or frightened element in people and bringing forth the power of that element, unquote. Ethical sadism retains sad commitments to sovereignty, that elementary libidinal driving force, an indestructible part in us that cannot be eliminated by any civilization, nor by the mandate to preserve relationships and make amends. The sexual is beyond and before the law, and this is precisely what has made it suspect in the political arena. By emphasizing pleasure, I'm not advocating for an egotistical and petty reign of hedonism dominating over the social good, but want to think about pleasure as a form of subjugated knowledge that can stimulate and even sustain our capacity to step beyond the lull of inclusion and group membership. How this kind of sadism can power our readiness to move beyond the docility extracted by institutions, a readiness to refuse the invitation to be incorporated into their structure, which is another way of saying this. In psychoanalysis and also in the academy, whatever leaks out of this regulated system is not immediately suppressed. It is first tried to be captured and to be regulated as value, to be turned into DEI, into inclusion, into promise, converted into invitations to participate in the organization, to teach, to write. It's converted into funding. It's dressed up as opportunity. These choices operate as Trojan horses. They work to inhibit resistance, to divorce radical thinking from radical action, to siphon revolutionary energies into theory building that is not made for change, but for falsification, not to change relations of power, but to become part of them. So even as we need to own the pleasurable part, what makes exigent sadism ethical is that it is not done self-righteously or to punish the person who harmed us. This would put us in different sadistic domains, which are more under the purview of the ego. It is precisely not about keeping score. Exigent sadism also has to be distinguished from the politics of grievance on the right or the left, which make the wound into an identity and an injury that can be precisely mapped and which leaves no residue and admits of no fugitivity. This is what I was referring to earlier when I was talking about Holocaust exceptionalism, when the ban on translation means that never again is only and always never again to us, as opposed to never again to anyone. Ethical sadism works not towards synthesis, not towards Hegelian repair, but towards the surfacing of friction. It keeps at the wound, insistent to refuse to let the harm disappear, which is what repair amounts to render it visible. How does one take such a risk? How does one put so much on the line? This is where our own resistances come in, because part of what makes accepting the other's reparations so enticing is that it also protects us from registering the degree of the damage we have suffered. Better to be magnanimous with the other, rich in our resources, than to notice the gushing wound, than to contend with just how badly we have been treated. And here, Noel's work on the fear of breakdown is really important. With how profound the indifference or the selfishness we have suffered, despite proclamations to the contrary, to truly register just how deep and repetitive the cuts. In refusing repair, exigent sadism is not indifferent to the other's gesture. To the contrary, what the exigent sadist seeks to do is to stage an encounter that stands to rearrange the terms by which the offer has been made, not through reaching for a third. For me, the concept of the third is more devoted to conserving relationships. It's more allied with protecting the ego's libidinal investments, but by demanding something more and something more substantial of the other to transform something in themselves. Put differently, the space of exigent sadism is the space where relationships are truly tested, put to the test and to the anguish of loss. Such loss, if it occurs, is not out of destructivity. Contrary to destructive sadism, ethical sadism does not aim to destroy a relationship. And if a relationship does break, which it might, the ethical sadist assumes their portion of responsibility for this outcome. She owns rather than disavows her role in the rupture. To be able to bear that, however, one has to be able to imagine not being in relation, an idea that our psychoanalytic theories are loath to consider. And this is again where sovereignty becomes critical. Severing ties, breaking ranks, endangering connections, disaffiliating from organizations, all of these are very scary. It is also, by the way, what many of us are so admiring of in the ongoing student protest movement. No doubt it is terrifying to walk away from what one has mastered, from cultivated relationships and decidedly hard-won positions, from offers of inclusion, of awards, of scholarship, of publishing opportunities, of administrative power. Giving up so much is no doubt costly, and it may even feel, it often does, to be beyond someone's affordances. In real time, this may feel like being suspended in mid-air, after one has let go of one vine, propelling oneself forward, but before the next one has appeared, a risk in the order of what Marquis de Sade has described as, quote, thinking and living in excess of our present conditions, unquote. Aren't you afraid of losing your job? An interviewer recently asked Professor Tiffany Willoughby Herard at UC Irvine as she was being ferried away, restrained by cops in riot gear for supporting her students' protest. What job do I have, she answered, if my students don't have a future? What ethical sadism asks of the other is therefore far more difficult than facile acknowledgments, superficial apologies, or the molasses of endless dialogue. At its best, exigent sadism inaugurates a crisis in the other because it recognizes that the weight of such a moment does not rest in palliative solutions, like expressions of regret, but in the true reckoning of the other's own entanglement. In its energetically charged confrontation of the other, this sadism stages encounters that, if met by the other's own passibility, can extend far beyond the reaches of his cerebral or empathetic response, inaugurating a reckoning that can shatter the other's ego, liquidating the links of their own translations, which is another way of saying that sadism may prove, this kind of sadism, may prove transformative for the other, which is what makes it an odd form of care. This, of course, is not something that can be accomplished by the sadist. The sadist can only offer the opportunity, though to call it an opportunity makes it sound as if the sadist does it for the other's sake, which is not necessarily the case. A lot will eventually depend on how much the other allows themselves to be affected by the sadist, how passable they make themselves. A sadism that is ethical in that sense does not build a system. It does not work by mastery. It works by offering the conditions for the rupture of the ligaments that hold the other's translations together. We should do well to remember here Freud's words, quote, that it is a matter of general observation that people never willingly abandon a libidinal position, unquote. In saying this, he was thinking of the press that the analyst has to exert on the patient, and I don't have time to go into the clinical implication of exigent sadism today. But these words are perhaps what Stefan Zweig had in mind when he described Freud as a truth sadist. If exigent sadism does dissolve the ligaments of the other's bindings towards overwhelm, if it occasions a revision of the other's translation, this isn't destructiveness. The press until the wound is exposed, which is what refusing the reparative does, is sometimes experienced as a crude and obscene gesture to which the other may respond poorly, accusing the sadist of being uncooperative, of not being a team player, of splitting, of oversimplifying the situation, of being too aggressive. This characterization will hurt and should be understood as efforts to break one's spirit. Though by spirit here, I'm not referring to self-esteem or confidence, though these too may be affected. I'm referring to the sovereignty and the sturdiness in us. Nor is this shattering only something that the other undergoes. The sadist too lives behind a version of themselves that they can't return to. The rupture is not just a loss on the level of their relationship. It is a decisive step for the sadist that makes it harder for her to return to her earlier ways, to accepting things as they were. And that adds to why it's so difficult to operate in an ethically sadistic way. And I would say that Aaron Bushnell's self-immolation is a very strong example of that, because his asked something that was not for himself, but aimed to provoke us to examine our own relationship to how our governments support Israeli violence. To be clear, exigent sadism may also break the relationship. But what exigent sadism does is to give the relationship a true fighting chance, a chance to be transformed into something more viable, less harmful, and more honest. It is a full-throated ask, and in that sense, it is also a vigorous act of hope, shamelessly naked, exposing the rawness of need as it is felt. The exigent sadist is truly vulnerable to the other's response. The other party has to do their own work, and that's an invitation that they may or not accept. Though the exigent sadist also recognizes that just as she exercises her own sovereignty, the other has to exercise their own sovereignty as well. To do that work, the other person has to stay in relation, to suspend reflexive responses, to withdraw. And it is impossible, of course, for the sadist to have no attachment to how the other person responds, which is another way of saying that the sadist approaches the encounter not hopelessly, but with a very sharpened sense of hope, hope that can be easily dashed. The exigent sadist keeps negation on the table. The exigent sadist takes that risk. And part of that risk involves discovering that the sadist is not that special, that we are fungible, exchangeable for other more docile subjects. What is risk and cost, though, if not another way of speaking about expenditure, of rebelling against the ruse that our resources are scant and we dreadfully threatened if we don't watch over them? One of my key interventions today has been to show that what depletes and impoverishes us is not expenditure, but the unwillingness to risk ourselves. Exigent sadism is to be given a chance to see the world more intensely when so many of us would rather postpone our lives. And this is an act of tremendous care. To track dialogues and repairs ancestral infrastructure is to show how psychoanalysis conditions us against political thinking and how it pens us into the clinic. My paper today follows Walter Benjamin's call to make concepts, quote, unusable for fascism, unquote, to make the reparative. So my investment today is to make the reparative less liable to being put in the service of pacifying insurgent energies. As part of that project, I have wanted to contest a de-sexualized psychoanalytic brand that implicitly champions the preservation of relations in current social structures, come what may. To criticize the reparative, as I have done this morning, is to ruffle psychoanalytic articles of faith, and in this sense, my presentation is itself an exercise of exigent sadism, and not only because I've been going on for very long. I know I'm asking a lot of us, but we should accept nothing less than asking a lot of each other and of our theories. I did start us out today saying that our theory needs to have teeth, that it needs to work like the throwing of a stone. So if this sounds harsh and sadistic, well, so be it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Avgi. I'd like to invite our first respondent, Lisa Duggan, now.
Hi, well, first I really would like to thank both Avgi and the Red Clinic for having me on. I'm such a fan of, and I read and teach and think alongside of many of the people who have appeared on the Red Clinic. So I'm really very happy to be here. But I also should say that of the people speaking today, I'm the only one who has no psychoanalytic training, and I actually do not write within a psychoanalytic framework. However, I do teach, write, and think alongside psychoanalytic frameworks. My work would be located in what is very loosely called in the academy affect studies. And affect studies, for those of you who are not in the academic realm, is a conglomeration really of frameworks and vocabularies that draw from cultural Marxism, like Raymond Williams's concept of structures of feeling, all the way through to Deleuzian ideas of affect, of some very different kinds of concepts and formations to pull together overlapping interdisciplinary work in affect studies. The affect studies also has a public political kind of outgrowth. There's a series of groups together nationally in the United States that are called the Public Feelings Project. And the Public Feelings Project has had chapters in Chicago, New York, Austin, and a few other places. But my favorite action of the Public Feelings Group was a conference that they had on political depression, which included the march of the politically depressed in bathrobes with bedhead carrying prescription pill bottles with signs saying depression, it could be political. So that included both artists and activists and some of the academically located people who work in the field of affect studies. And that's approximately where my work is located, at that boundary between that kind of activism and the and that sort of broad realm of scholarship. So as I was reading Avgi's paper, I kept thinking of one of the key figures in affect studies, and that's Lauren Berlant's book on cruel optimism. There were so many resonances between Avgi's paper and that, using a different vocabulary, right? But Lauren Berlant is writing about the manufacture of consent for neoliberalism. And she talks about and analyzes the attachments people form to ways of living that actually prevent their flourishing, right? Their attachment to relationships, to institutions, to ideas that actually damage them, and that these attachments are persistent. They require repeated investments and a kind of optimism that she's calling cruel. And they're very difficult to let go of. So Berlant is writing about cruel optimism and the difficulty of disengaging. In the same way, Avgi is talking about exigent sadism to some extent. Avgi's image of letting go of one branch before you really know there's another one there to grab a hold of is really what Berlant is saying about how difficult it is to let go of the false promises of neoliberalism, and why people remain invested and consent to it. Another thing that really struck me is, Berlant's book on cruel optimism is about the project of neoliberalism, but it's quite exceptional in that literature. Really, most of the massive literature on neoliberalism is located in the social sciences, and it excludes the psychic, the cultural, the sexual, the intimate, gender, sexuality, and race for the most part. It's a discourse about capitalism that argues it is mostly leftist version of a leftist analysis in the kind of de-sexualized rationalism that Avgi was talking about. It's a consequence of the suppression of the sexual in the discourse, the literature, right, on neoliberalism. And you can see that very starkly when you put that alongside a literature that deals with the same overlapping historical phenomena, but focuses instead on racial capitalism, empire, and colonialism. That literature is deeply inflected with queer and feminist perspectives, and it brings the sexual and formations of the sexual and of gender, sexuality, intimate life, and race right into the center of the analysis, which produces a very different kind of work, although both are talking about what we call late capitalism. It always strikes me as optimistic to refer to it as late capitalism, but that's, sort of the overlap of the framework. So you get, on the one hand, so the work of someone like David Harvey, and on the other hand, the recent book by, if you haven't seen it, you should go out and look at it immediately, a book by Nefertiti Tardieu called Remaindered Life, which is absolutely brilliant and is about the operations of empire, colonialism, neoliberalism, and which includes all of the thematics that are excluded from, say, the version and the narrative that the social science literature on neoliberalism produces. But when I was thinking about, so I wonder about those two literatures, and I think it's something to press on, and Avgi's paper has made me think about it anew to try and sort out why, because those are the two literatures that I am deeply engaged with and constantly frustrated by the cleavage between the two, which seems semi-insane to me. But there were three moments also while I was reading Avgi's paper that just were resonant for me. So I'll say something about each of those briefly. And one is, I wrote a short memoirish kind of essay for my Substack, Commie Pinko Queer, a while ago, talking about my understanding of my own positioning, my own sexual positioning as queer, in which I talk about it, not as an issue of identity or sexual preference really at all, but as a kind of narrative escape from the sexual and gender and domestic norms of my own particular race, class, and geographical locations as a white working class girl in the post-war South in the United States. And how becoming queer for me was really a matter of reaching escape velocity. And that is reaching the point of what I think Avgi would denominate in part as exigent sadism, which is not only the ability, but the pressure to get the hell out of there. And to transform my way of living. in a way that it has some kinship with what Avgi's talking about when she talks about Fred Moten's notion of fugitivity. So it's not a willed, it was never a willed or a conscious project, but drew upon forces of unconscious energy that were really pretty opaque to me, and that I thought of as, when I was a teenager and young adult, as my pilot light, right? When my pilot light was on, I was able to get away from toxic relationships, contexts, racial ideologies. It took the operations of this pilot. It wasn't always on. Sometimes I collapsed, back into trying to make things work. But when it was on, it got me from Virginia to New York to begin with. But then it also really was the energy, this relatively opaque to me energy, that kept transforming my life and caused me to eschew the non-dialogic reparative course of action that all my therapists recommended. So my therapists were always recommending that I try to repair the ruptures, and I never would freaking do it. And I have no contact with anyone in my biological family, and that is not something that many therapists think is a good idea. Last time I even flew over Virginia, I broke a tooth. But this isn't a kind of pilgrim's progress, the escape from confining domesticity into a kind of utopian, peaceful freedom that sometimes the narrative of second wave feminism really narrates for, white working middle class girls in the United States. But instead, it was a transition into a kind of really trauma, what Avgi calls traumaphilic turbulence. Well, I use turbulence, she uses traumaphilic. I didn't transition into a peaceful, loving, wonderful, happy, creative life. I transformed into a context that allowed me to have dialogic relations in the face of trauma, and that really kept the retranslations and detranslations going and continuing, instead of fixing me in that sort of reparative hell of trying to fix things that were not fixable. I mean, I remember one conversation with my father, a committed alcoholic, when I'm explaining to him all the reasons that I really am not in touch, and his response was, "I'm sorry you believe so many things that are not true." So it's really, and that goes for the larger political context that I came out of, the neighborhood I lived in, and not just the one situation. But it's not like it took me to paradise, like queerness is paradise. It took me to a lot of love and trouble and conflict and difficulty, but it was a much more productive kind of turbulence than the one that I was able to detach from. So the second thing that I thought of when I was reading Avgi's paper was my deep involvement in what were called the feminist sex wars in the US, the UK, and Australia in the 1980s, which is now repeatedly, constantly, and over again reductively narrated as anti-porn feminism versus pro-sex feminism, which is, pro-sex is such a hilariously stupid designation, because of course definition and context matter entirely to what one counts as sex or pro, right? So it tells you nothing to call some group of people pro-sex. To me, at the time, my experience was that this was a conflict between a vision of sexuality as fully integrated, fully merged into love and intimacy in the way that Avgi was describing in the later Freud, right? Like merging sexuality, love, and intimacy, which is what has been called anti-porn feminism wished to do with sexuality, is to make it into love. And on the other side, viewing sexuality as a desiring force, and as a force of creativity in politics, as well as in intimate life, that was indispensable to the feminist project. And to me, that was the conflict, the merging or the not of sexuality into love and intimacy. The third thing really has to do with something Avgi also touched on briefly, and that is NYU, the institution that Avgi and I share, where the president, Linda Mills, is a scholar of social work who has spent her entire life studying trauma and restorative justice, right? So this is exactly the kind of liberal reparations that she advocates here, that repairs the sense of goodness to those in power, to those who call the police, right? And this is the process in which she attempted to practice that, was that she dropped the arrest charges against students and said substituted, well, not her alone, but the administration, substituted these essays that students were required to write that to narrate the harms that they had caused, both to Zionist students and to the institution of NYU. They were specifically, explicitly denied the option of critiquing the institution or the conduct regulations under which they had been arrested. They were required to narrate their own culpability, and in order not to get a censure on their permanent record. So, this reminded me of a joke I used to have with a friend where we would talk about, she was a social worker, we would talk about social work and global conflict resolution, where you would get someone like Putin and someone like Zelensky together to engage in active listening. This sort of liberal restorative justice, which is what Linda Mills has represented, which has turned out to be quite violent and consequential for so many of our students and our faculty and staff here. But it's important to remember the difference between this kind of restorative justice, because the same term is used between that and the kind of restorative justice advocated by prison abolitionists, who are calling for a kind of mutual transformative encounter that addresses not only the involved parties, but also the economic, political, and social structures that condition and shape harm in the first place. So that's a very different notion. And, to get the confused, like, oh, our president is in favor of restorative justice, thinking the abolitionist version, it's important to make the distinction between the liberal reparative and the radically transformative forms of restorative justice. So I'm going to end by asking a question that kind of vexes me all the time, because I write about the right wing. I've recently been writing about the right wing. And the practice that you see on most mainstream media of Trump voters being confronted with instrumental rationality, the instrumental rationality of the fact check and policy advocacy, and the hopelessness, the endlessness and hopelessness of this encounter. If any of you have ever seen Jordan Klepper from The Daily Show go to a Trump rally and interview all the people at a Trump rally, on the one hand, it's deeply hilarious, and on the other hand, it's profoundly frustrating because he keeps presenting them with their own contradictions, their own irrationalities. He states simply, it's the back and forth exposes the complete lack of rationality in the attendees at the Trump rally, but it doesn't bother them at all, nor do they alter or change their position when confronted with that. It doesn't even make them pause. There's not even a pause. So this from reading Avgi's paper, it gave me another way of thinking about this question, or this problem of the Trump voter, in which, in a way, it's the anarchic energy of breaking with the neoliberal status quo, right? It's like absolute compulsion, opaque to rationality, determination to break with the neoliberal status quo, which is in fact deeply harmful and not in their own self-interest, is to the way this energy is directed into a fantasy of return to a social order before trauma. Now, that fantasy is only available to some people. Most people know there is no time before trauma, historically, for the groups with they identify. There are only some people who are able to imagine there's a time before trauma when white men and people who own property could be uncontested, et cetera. But the process of taking the energy of people who actually don't belong to those groups, increasing numbers of Trump voters are non-white, many are working class, right? Taking people and taking that energy of disaffection and translating it into this fantasy of a return to a time before trauma, I think is something really that I think about all the time and never can really completely figure out. So thank you, Avgi, and to the Red Clinic.
I'm so happy to be here, honored, delighted to be in your company, as well as all who have joined us. So let me begin. Avgi Saketopoulou has been reading my mail. That's the feeling I get when hearing her account of the phenomenon I've been living through. So let me tell you first about that. And then I will offer a modest reformulation of her theory, very, very modest. Not 3 weeks after Emory University's president called in militarized police forces to take down a small group of peaceful demonstrators, they brutally assaulting students and professors and dragging many of us to jail, this president started talking about repairing trust and healing, even as he refused to admit having done anything wrong. And I'm on the University Senate Executive Committee, and I asked him point blank what he would do differently if he could, and he said nothing. He would do nothing. Mm. So in various venues, rather than address the harm his office inflicted, the discussion kept circling back to rebuilding trust, healing, and repairing the relationship between the community and the administration. I also saw a glimpse of this phenomena in interactions with two of my colleagues on the University Senate Executive Committee. In the week following the April 25th police assault on our campus, we were meeting and discussing these meetings that we had with the president, and I was saying that I don't think this really went very well. These sessions somehow got dubbed as listening sessions. I'm not sure who was supposed to be listening to whom, the president to us or us to him. But in either case, I found this nomenclature quite disturbing. As these went on, two of us on the executive committee in correspondence among ourselves pushed back against how these sessions were being run. And in response to our objections in an email thread, one member of the committee chastised us for interrupting and potentially disrupting the process. He said, any deviation from our agreed upon guidelines could have led to chaos and undermined the purpose of the webinar, which is to facilitate constructive inquiry and aid in the healing process for our community. And he continued, I urge each of us to maintain our focus on fostering community healing and avoid actions that may exacerbate existing issues or cause further distress. So I wrote back, can we focus on the actual work we need to do? I think our main order of business is to fully investigate what led to the events of April 25th. We have not yet done so. Focusing on healing now is not only premature, but could distract us from the business at hand, including finding out how much of the brutality of that day was orchestrated by President Fenves himself. And that's how I left it there. I was trying to be circumspect. I could have added that I have a court date coming up, so healing seems a bit premature. Moreover, no one had ever said that the purpose of these sessions was to aid in the healing process, but this committee member just jumped to that conclusion. And oh my God, here we were, the troublemakers, exacerbating existing issues and causing further distress. You can see how Avgi's been reading my mail. I must say that ever since then, my mission has been to exacerbate these issues and cause further distress. To wit, I have written op-eds for the student newspaper, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Last week, one came out for Scientific American, of all places. I've done interviews and podcasts with TV, radio, print throughout the world, including the Washington Post, Al Jazeera, Australia's Philosophy Zone, and the magazines The Cut and The Atlantic. I've been participating in academic meetings on what the hell is going on. For nearly 2 months, my current full-time job has been to call out what is wrong with my university administration's positions. And I admit to taking great pleasure in this. All this is to say that I fit Avgi's bill as an exigent sadist. But still, I resist the term exigent sadist. So let me say quickly how it is that I can agree so profoundly with her observations, but disagree with the nomenclature. So 10 quick points. The background of Avgi's critique is the dominance of contemporary relational theory, with its roots in Klein and its more recent focus on repairing the relationship with the potentially lost thing/mother. Now, my institute, it has a lot of relational, contemporary relational, but it's not dominated that way. So I haven't felt the need to resist against it in the same way. But, anyway, while I've drawn on Klein, though I've also been frustrated by the kind of telos that is going to take it the best end as the depressive position. So I also disagree with the relational dogma that babies are relational from the start. I don't know whether Avgi believes that or not, but I think that is just false. I think the path to sociality is fraught and contingent. And for another, pre-Oedipal phenomena, as I see them, are about negotiating the loss of the mother, not trying to fold her back. So despite the current dominance of the relational school, I think that much psychoanalytic theory is not so focused on repair. So anyway, all of this is to say that I think that Avgi's parousia, her courageousness, is to call out what is dominant in the tradition perhaps she's been trained in, but there's a lot of psychoanalysis that does not follow along with the relational model. So Avgi does make this distinction. I just want to highlight it. There's a lot of psychoanalytic theory out there that doesn't give a damn about reparations. 2, with Avgi, I am frustrated by Klein's theory of the depressive position. I don't like that Klein's theory seems to end there. The depressive position is hardly a satisfying high point of infantile or human development. It is good as a work of mourning and reconciliations, but says nothing about living a rich and creative life. For that, we need to turn to other theories. 3, Avgi, following David Ng, worries that Klein's theory encourages making nice with one's oppressors. This is a phenomenon way beyond Klein, right? Just people have been noticing this for a long time. So I think also Audre Lorde, I went back to her work. She's really a great partner for Avgi's project. So I just want to try to, in point 4, to clarify a little bit, I think, about what Klein is good for. I'm not sure that the depressive position itself, at least our first encounter with it, leads to excusing our oppressors. Rather, I think that initially it allows for the infant to realize that its primary caregiver is a whole object with all kinds of complexities and nuances, not the split good or bad breast, but a person with both good and bad parts, and all kinds of parts in between. In my own work, I have focused more on how this allows the infant to move beyond splitting to tarrying with complexity, in part to realize that the notion that the bad breast was trying to destroy the subject had to be tempered by the reality that the same person was also the good breast. The very notion of being destroyed, oppressed, was a delusion of sorts. That's Klein's, I think, point. That's the benefit of the depressive position. Its aim is not to absolve an actual oppressor, but for the infant to realize that this initial experience of oppression was rather delusional. We could call this a primary depressive position, that first dawning of other people as whole objects. 5. Now I can see how there is a short leap from that insight to the fact that subsequently we tend to want to forgive actual oppressors. So this is a problem, all right? And it's not a problem that Klein helps resolve. So we could call this maybe a secondary depressive position, doing that primary, secondary narcissism kind of thing. The primary one is to first go, oh, you're a whole object. But secondary is when later in life, the kind of après coup, we go, oh, are you like my mother? Are you my mother? So could there be a problematic secondary depressive position where guilt kicks in when confronted with people who are actually oppressing us? And the infantile urge for survival leads to panic and self-destructive reparation. So this is just a little, I think, modification of what Avgi's already doing. 6, what beyond the depressive position might be a better position when we encounter people who do seem to be actually out to destroy us? Like the police called in to take down a peaceful protest, and the university administration who called them to come in, and then quickly demanded that we all heal and move on. Here, any evocation of a depressive position would be nuts. No one on the quad was unaware that the president was a whole object, though they might have wanted him to behave like one. 7, I think we need to move beyond the depressive position, that is, have yet another position. Thanks to Avgi's work, I think we could call it an exigent position. I'm still not convinced that the term sadism adds enough, though I must say, listening to her just now and trying to kind of recover the actual Sade, what he actually said, that is helpful, but I'm still not convinced. because it's so overladen with all the other misreadings. It's hard to tell people to hear the word differently. And why bother? And I can hardly wait. So, this is kind of a risk to have, this is being recorded. I doubt if my university administration is going to come to the Red Clinic and watch this. But if they say, aha, see, she's a sadist. So why bother when a rich understanding of an exigent position as a libidinal force does the work? To work well, as Avgi beautifully explains, exigency is fueled by libido. It is motivated by an unconscious that will not settle with trying to make nice. That's the whole Laplanchian move. It will be bold and fearless and reckless. So I think that the term exigent position does all the kind of work without the baggage of sadism, though it's not quite as sexy as so I do admit it's less sexy. 8, I felt that way quite a bit, fearless and reckless. I think this is the position that many of us here have been occupying. Also the position that so many of my colleagues and faculty at Emory and other universities have been occupying, speaking truth to power, caring more about justice than our relationship to the institutions. In fact, caring more about the institution despite the perverse relationships its current leaders have been trying to inculcate. 9, let me add that I am not trying to repair Klein's theory. I can take it or leave it. I look for help wherever I can get it. Also, I think we could fold an exigent position into most any psychoanalytic approach, not just a Kleinian one. I think any psychoanalytic approach that takes the unconscious seriously. And by the way, a little footnote to that. I do worry that sometimes contemporary relational theory doesn't take the unconscious very seriously. 10, finally, let's also rethink, dialogue etymologically to make it less useful for fascism. So dialogue, and Avgi knows this with Greek background, her language, dialogue does not mean two speaking, that it's not two, it means across or through, etymologically, as through, across, cutting through. It's more like parousia for the sake of justice, rather than a logos of preservation. That's my 10 points. I can't wait until the fall when the first healing session that the university announces is announced, because do I have a theory for them? Oh, yes, I do. Thank you, Avgi.
Thank you very much, Noelle, and thanks also to Lisa. Turn now finally to Lara Shiha, long-time comrade and friend of the Red Clinics.
Thanks, Luke. And يا هلا بالكل. شكرا كتير. Avgi, thank you so much for inviting me. And after Lisa and Noelle went, it's just an honor to be here. And the Red Clinic, of course, as always. Okay. I've been thinking a lot lately about psychic intrusions and the various ways we can refuse them. A theory with teeth. One that is stone, is a rock throw, is antagonistic to the normative hum of a deathscape, is one such way that Avgi's theory gives us, and for that I'll always be grateful to you, Avgi. For those of you who know me or heard me speak before, you'll also know that I've spoken about the ways that psyops work. They actually work because the power and its mechanisms of abuse demand that affect is excised as a precondition. This is in fact one of the wagers of the type of hollow repair Avgi has warned us about. You must come already having worked through all the stuckness, certainly no messy affect, absolutely no anger. The repair is merely a pro forma stamp that registers that the aggressor is ready for the spectacle of an audience. So naturally, in thinking about exigent sadisms, I let myself be flooded with affect as my guide, and thankfully Lisa's with us, so this should be cool. But for real now, it's also a challenge to include myself in this reflection, which is something that feels really important and almost urgent, and I'm thankful to Noelle also for including yourself. For the sake of time, I'll quickly mention 2 associations and what I am drawing from them, with hopes we can take them up further, of course, in the conversation. I'm aware, just like Avgi mentioned at the end of her talk, that this practice itself, bringing you into my own commitment to militancy and militant clarity, unbending naming, is a practice of exigent sadism, if we take Avgi's words for it. and we do. But then again, you're also here for a reason. So you're joining us in that. Avgi tells us, and I'm quoting here, in refusing repair, exigent sadism is not indifferent to the other's gesture. What the exigent sadist seeks to do, rather, is to stage an encounter that stands to rearrange the terms by which the relationship proceeds. With Palestine on my mind, in my heart and soul, I started to think, what if the mere presence of someone stages that encounter? In this case, the presence of an indigenous Palestinian, let alone a defiant one, a willful subject, as Sarah Ahmed reminds us, could be enough to stage that encounter. From there, I thought about how exigent sadism might also be about the way that presence is maintained, even if it is an absent presence. For example, once withdrawal from an organization renders that person still very much present, psychically, emotionally, even procedurally and administratively. Trust me, I know. Just like Avgi plays with fugitivity, I'm here playing with what Indigenous scholar Leanne Betasamosake Simpson calls the method of, quote, embodied making and doing, or presencing. So just a couple thoughts here that I found myself associating to make the thinking a little more concrete for us. The first is personal, and the second is a regrounding in Palestine, and also a decided leaning into exigent sadism's political implications, which is really important for me, and I think also for the field if we're taking a theory with teeth seriously. So the first one. It may come as no surprise to folks here, likely, that in the midst of a global Zionist smear campaign against me, the American Psychoanalytic Association prohibited me from speaking at their June 2023 meeting, despite my having been on their program committee for many years and as their chair of their Teachers Academy. I'll spare people the now boring details of an incredibly violent string of events, but two things stood out to me in reading Avgi's paper. The first is a now infamous email that the then president wrote to the membership, announcing this decision. And here are his words. Quote, a polarizing question was raised in the program committee about whether to invite a well-known and controversial figure in our field to present on a panel at our upcoming virtual meeting in June 2023. She is a member in good standing of the American Psychoanalytic Association. And I'm going to insert ellipses here. We felt that the association could not contain a session with her on it. And some of us also felt uncomfortable with having a presenter who has been on record as making what some believe are statements that may constitute hate speech, end quote. This is the same person who, by the way, later in print in The Guardian called himself a necessary sacrificial lamb. So that gives us a little bit of context. Here's where we start to see how the violence of this act hinged on my absence presence versus my presence absence, which is what I'm actually interested in, and where I think Avgi's theorizing takes us. I've referred to this before as disappearing the Arab as a fix for anti-Semitism. At the time, I was more concerned on retaining my ability to think. But over the course of the last 1.5 years, and with more urgency since October, I've been adamant on theorizing. This is something that Avgi's work has helped me do tremendously. In thinking through Avgi's prison here, I can see what my response to this email engaged in. A refusal of absence presence and an exigent sadistic insistence of my presence, even in absence. So I'm drawing distinction here between the forcibly absence presence and the present absent, which is something the exigent sadist engages in, I believe. I believe in practicing how we do this, even if we only retroactively understand it as such, partially to disrupt and upend the normativity that is etched into well-worn routes of ego reorganization, as Avgi alerts us to. So in that practicing out loud and here with you in community, here is part of what I wrote, which reminds me of Noelle's emphatic no. And this is my language here. I'm writing publicly as the unnamed but targeted person you allude to in your email. To foremost name the politically motivated, racist, and discriminatory actions of the American Psychoanalytic Association and reject and refuse the dishonest and bad faith communication that you've now disseminated to the membership. And I later go on. Your false and defamatory categorization of me is unwarranted and stokes a fire that is larger than APSA, a fire that has included actual hate speech against me, threats of forced deportation, rape, and bodily harm to me and my family. It is also a dangerous categorization that puts the onus on me, an Arab woman, to prove as a precondition to all else that I am not anti-Semitic. And the only way to do that is to declare that I am not an anti-Zionist. It is a setup, it is racist, it's discriminatory, and APSA is complicit. Again, and this is what that ends the email part. Again, while yes, this example is about me, it's also bigger, and it's bigger than APSA, which is also what Avgi is asking us to think about. Presencing as exigent sadism. In absent presence, what neoliberal or sort of forces like APSA might expect us to do, in absent presence, repair can happen in absence, especially if the goal is what we call in Arabic, تغسيل damir, the literal washing of one's conscience. The person doesn't engage and they're free of the responsibility, right? Revolutionary or otherwise. So I can't tell you the number of times I got emails from folks within APSA, members, analysts, young and old, who told me, why don't you just apologize? If you just apologized, we could move into dialogue. Right. So that's APSA. Number 2. I want to spend a little bit of time on Avgi's use of dispossession. I'm here treading with tenderness, another place in which one must trust someone's politics to be able to play in this way, to play with sadism. Avgi discussing dispossession, transforming and transmuting it, is something I can engage precisely because I know the psychic, affective, and political meaning she has as a Cypriot with occupied Cyprus. If you haven't read her piece in Counterpunch on the ethics of violence, please do so. And I'm going to just drop that there for everybody to engage in. And movingly, of course, in this, her great-grandmother's Adigoni's bold and unmoving presence. Here's where I can join, and there's the affect. Here's where I can join her in thinking with dispossession otherwise. Dispossess as divestment, as in not to possess, to not consume, to practice a different type of discipline that disrupts that social and political order, one that is anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, which to me is another version of presencing. This is the political importance of this theorizing, actual material political impact. So my association grounds us back in Palestine, with Palestinian political prisoners, and specifically with recent martyr Walid Daqqa and his own theorizing on exigent sadism, even though I couldn't have seen it as such prior to engaging in Avgi's work. Walid Daqqa was a political prisoner for 38 years. He was murdered by the genocidal Israeli state by refusing him necessary medical care for his cancer. He died on April 7th of this year. And to make things worse, his body, like many other Palestinian prisoners' bodies, is still being held by the Zionist genocidal state, intent to have him fulfill his entire sentence, so to speak, even in death. Walid was prolific in his writing. And importantly, to Avgi's invitation about life, he smuggled out his sperm to insist on Palestinian futures. He and his wife had a child, a present absence of life force, an exigent sadistic act of being in spite. And here, perhaps Noelle also anticipated Audre Lorde, and I'm quoting her here. This is what Audre Lorde maybe was referring to when she said, quote, "We tend to think of the erotic as an easy, tantalizing sexual arousal. I speak of the erotic as the deepest life force," what she later called lesbian consciousness, "a force which moves us towards living in a fundamental way," end quote. So when Walid Daqqa writes his book, translated Searing Consciousness, or On Redefining Torture, He moves us towards living in a fundamental way. It feels like a perfect and perhaps stunningly obvious example of exigent sadism, but brought into being through Avgi's work. I couldn't have seen it before. Even the title is a translational movement on redefining torture. Rina Abirannam, who has recently written the first account in English of this book, says, quote, Walid identifies a process where a previously solidified consciousness dissolves into a workable object after being subjected to conditions that surmount its threshold for compactness. After consistently exposing consciousness to this intervening variable beyond its ability to endure it, consciousness is rendered pliable and can then be reconstructed depending on the structure that contains it, or in the Palestinian case, the structures dictated by Zionist occupation, end quote. In just sort of taking us a little further, I'm going to post in the Zoom Walid's actual words himself, and I think this helps us really get to the place. I'm going to read them, but I'd like us to sit with them, sit with the affect, sit with the political implications of what we're talking about if we sort of extend this. Both psychoanalytically, I'm not leaving the psychoanalytic, to the contrary, part of its force, its power, is because it's being translated in these ways, as Avgi invites us to think about. So these are his words. I want to assert that I only write because I want to remain steadfast and stalwart in captivity. Because when your body is buried underneath tons of concrete and metal and barbed wires, in front of this overwhelming truth, if left to sensory and rudimentary cognitive capacities, confronting this reality might lead you to madness. And madness under a deranged reality is the culmination of cognition, where the imaginative mind creates another reality that bypasses the prison walls. I think of writing as an operation of bypassing, of breaking out of those walls. I try to do it every day. It's the tunnel that I dug under their walls that moors me to life outside, to what concerns my people in Palestine and the Arab world. This should not imply that my writing is a dissociation from my reality inside the prison. On the contrary, as much as it is the creation of textual reality, writing is a methodological tool to deconstruct and make sense of my reality as a prisoner. So here, he's alerting us to the fact that isn't a fix to his being a prisoner, a captive, but a transformation that can happen otherwise. Walid, as in all political prisoners, his very presence, even locked away, even as he says, under their concrete and metal and barbed wire, is because the way he stages the encounter. This is what he invites us into. He refuses to bend under the will. He refuses to be docile, to not normalize the counters and the contours of what could be seen as material prison walls, or to be seduced into repair that would have him know his place, that would have him accept a supremacist organizing of reality as always already subjugated being, cemented in history, as Avgi tells us, with no potential for translational movement. So here we're invited back into the space that really matters, right? Where rubber hits the road. To do this work, we must risk not being liked. We have to risk not pleasing. We have to risk not stabilizing force, whether it's neoliberalism or capitalism or our institutes or our very relationships or our universities. This is what Avgi gives us, a praxis which is always disruptive and world-making. Theory as stone, to quote another exigent sadist close to my heart. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lara. Just like to invite Avgi to respond now before we open up to contributions from participants. Just to say, participants, if you'd like to speak on camera, please raise your hand, or you're welcome to put questions and comments in the chat.
I think I'm going to say one thing to each responded very quickly. It's not going to do justice to the richness of the responses, but I do want to open it up to the audience, and I'm sure that we will then loop together different thoughts. Like, First of all, thank you all so much. Like, you're raising so much. I took a lot of notes. Lisa, like, I am kind of like really taken kind of like, first of all, with this kind of like, what was your phrase? Like, becoming queer as reaching escape velocity, kind of like, which is like such an amazing kind of like phrase, kind of like, but I actually want to go to your other point about kind of like the instrumental rationality of going to a rally and actually trying to talk people out of things, trying to talk a fascist out of things, or the ways in which kind of like within psychoanalytic settings, transphobes are addressed as if they're going to be kind of like convinced by data, or as if you show the research, then clearly people will see that, you know, people should transition or do whatever they want to do. And I think that kind of like there's a phrase that kind of like Anne used kind of like and their keynote last year, kind of like that you can't find feelings with facts, which kind of like speaks to this question of like affect and logic. But what most compels me about what you're saying is kind of like the way that you speak about how we ourselves can so easily get caught in this rubric of dialogue. Like, if you convince that that's the neoliberal kind of like difficulty that you're speaking to, that on the one hand, kind of like true, kind of like there are versions of dialogue that we need to be able to preserve, but that's not it. And the ones that were usually offered are not it. And that we have our own libidinal investments in maintaining connections, even with people who we know are not just disinterested, but kind of like have harmful intentions and will kind of like either turn them into kind of like praxis or will support spaces and practices that put them into practice. So I wonder what it would mean for us to be thinking about divesting from these kinds of conversations. I gave a talk a few months ago at a Psychoanalytic Institute where I was arguing that we need to stop debating transphobes. We just need to stop having those conversations. These are not real debates. But the question of like what it touches on in us, how it grabs us, is kind of like where our work is. So kind of like, thank you for kind of like raising this. It's such a powerful example, and I hope to think more with you about that. And I'm really curious to see where you're going with it. Noelle, I've been thinking so much about your question of like, is sadism the word? And I'm very kind of like, I have strong feelings about why it is the word that we may or not talk about more in the Q&A. But I am thinking about that. So I just want to tell you that. But I'm going to pick up on something else that you raised about the question of the reparative. It's true that a lot of psychoanalytic theory is not dominated by the conception of the reparative. And even though kind of like I trained also as a relational analyst, I've moved so far away from relational thinking. That's not where my own interest in that comes from. It comes from the fact that, you know, between the comment that Lisa made that I just addressed, or how Lara is addressed by colleagues who very well-meaningly write to her, why don't you apologize? I think that the reparative has kind of like long escaped the confines of thinking relationally. In fact, I don't even know that it originated there. I think that the relational school has made a certain use of it. But I think that the idea that kind of like dialogue or repair will kind of like restore relationality I think that is not specific to the relational school. So when you were speaking about, kind of like, I think this connects also to what Lisa was saying about restorative justice versus transformative justice. This is something that Brianna Suklovic, a point that they made to me in discussing my work, that both of these frameworks also cannot imagine breaking relationships. And I'm not suggesting that we should just throw relationships away, but I think that we need to have space to imagine being able to break them. And that's what the reparative precludes us from being able to do. So I'm really curious where you might go with that. And Lara, it's always painful to hear you talk about APSA, like for so many reasons. But what I will say here is I'm thinking what you're saying about absence and presence and the presence of absence. And I wonder if, like, I think that you're already thinking about it this way, but you'll tell me if that's the case, that indeed absence can leave like a loud presence, but it depends also on what is the presence that has departed. And for that reason, I think that those of us who divest or who have resigned from institutions or decide to not participate in certain kinds of ventures need to do so. We leave a different mark of absence when we actually say why we're not participating, as opposed to just saying, thank you, but I'm not available or I'm too busy. It's a different kind of statement. And I suspect that if people are feeling kind of like the contours of your absence in various spaces, it's also because of how you've been present. So kind of like the two, I think, kind of like work, kind of like toggle between the two. I'm sure that is what you had in mind too. The question of, it's really moving to hear you speak about kind of like thinking about kind of like what comes out of writing from within conditions of confinement, which actually made me also think very much about Sade, was also kept for political reasons, though under very different circumstances. Kind of like to hear how this work kind of like makes you think about kind of like his own, this political prisoner's own act of retranslation is actually quite interesting. It takes me in a direction that I hadn't considered before. So I'm sorry for the really contracted comments, but you've been listening to us for a very long time, and I know that many people want to speak. So maybe we open it up. I'm sure we'll loop back around.
It's amazing to be here today, and it's amazing to listen to you all, having read your work and loved it so much. I wanted to raise a current challenge that's sort of a little bit similar, a mini version, Lara, of what you're going through a little bit at the moment, and to try and sort of gain some of the solidarity from that, I think, because it's the solidarity of talking together that, you know, is so valuable. Because maybe one of the things that we talk about the sadism and the need to be, you know, to hold true to that, value the pleasure, but also being able to own the destructiveness, but also the fear, you know, and people have touched on the fear that comes back. So I recently took over as the book reviews editor for the British Journal of Psychotherapy, and wanted immediately, as soon as I got the job in the first edition, to publish a review of your book, Lara, because it's so important. Really not that known in the UK, you know, I don't think, and certainly not in the sort of mainstream, which the mainstream norm is, as exactly as you guys have described so beautifully, you know, psychoanalysis is not political, it shouldn't have any political purpose, and of course, just maintain the status quo, get lots of rich clients, build your private practice, you know, don't challenge things too much. Yeah, I can hear my voice going the same as yours, Lara. Avgi, you actually put me in contact with a wonderful writer, Paddy Farr, who I thought would just be a perfect person to review the book and kind of really capture and speak to the force of the book and how powerful it is. And so we published it in the first, it's gone out online so far, but not yet in print. And there has been a huge counter response that has been like very attacking, particularly, you know, of my role and, you know, too inexperienced to have done the post. No one would have published it otherwise, you know, that kind of thing. And it's been really scary, actually. Like, it's a tiny version and, you know, it's kind of keeping in thing. And as a candidate myself, you suddenly think, oh God, I shouldn't have put my head above the parapet, you know, never going to get qualified. And yeah, it's so, and the other side of it is keeping the other side is people are dying. You know, like this argument is so irrelevant, but it doesn't feel that irrelevant when you're in the middle of it, you know, compared to the force of what people are really going through in Palestine, which is just on another level. And yeah, so I just kind of wanted to raise it because because it feels very relevant and ties into your work, but also because it's kind of ongoing. And I suppose because, as we know, the people on the other side are very, very good at voicing their opinions, writing letters. Nobody's really challenging the content of the review. It's very much, it's inappropriate, it's offensive, you know, all the kind of repair narratives, you know, that you guys are talking about. And so I think if the journal can hear from other people that actually there are a lot of people out there that value the fact that it, you know, as a mainstream journal is publishing, and it links, it's actually owned by the BPF, the British Psychoanalytical Federation, which this week apologized for having advertised on its website something for Voices for Palestine. And it removed it from the website, which was an event, and apologized to the membership because, again, exactly the same as what's happening with the, you know, the review of your book, Lara. There was a very strong reaction. And yeah, it apologized and said, we're not a political organization, as if psychoanalysis could ever as you all have beautifully spoken to, could ever be anything other than political. So yeah, I just wanted to share it with people, and thank you so much for all your work, all of you guys.
Shall we take a couple of questions and then address them together so we have, so more people can speak?
Naira, would you like to speak?
Yeah, am I unmuted now?
Yes.
Hi. Thanks. Thank you, Avgi, and everybody else. That was all really brilliant. Except that I also, I think, missed a lot. So my question might also reflect that. I was thinking about, so my question is a little bit about the connection you were making about the sort of absenting of the sexual. So I guess, like, and you mentioned obviously the kind of dominant discourse, like we could say Zionist discourses about the Holocaust, or dominant type of discourse about the Holocaust that's never again for us, and Afro-pessimism. And I guess I was thinking, this is, I don't know if you'd call it a Nakba discourse, but like Nakba narratives also obscure the sexual violence that occurred. You know, there is a novel that came out recently, Minor Detail, in the current genocide, when people talk about we're seeing the Nakba unfold before our eyes, now we know what it's like. I also hear that as a kind of sideways reference also to the sexual violence. But I also, and I don't think this is because I'm invested in Palestinian liberation, I don't see like Nakba discourse as closed, and I see it as really generative. And I think the fact that it can open up to liberation for all is, and does, is like testament to that. So I wondered if you could say a little bit about that. And I guess I think how I would see a difference between Afro-pessimism and Holocaust discourse on one side versus the Nakba is that both of them proclaim themselves as ultimate victims, which Nakba narrative doesn't do, because from the start it's an anti-colonial. And I would see that as the key difference about their liberatory or conservative potential. So, and I didn't, yeah, so that's that first question. The second question echoes one in the chat, which is about like, okay, if there are different types of sadism, can there not be different types of dialogue? So I was thinking about one, like a really formative thing in my ethical development was one growing up with like kids of photos of deformed kids in Iraq, the Gulf War, but two, having to make tea for Gulf War veterans in our house. And I didn't understand why my mom was making me do that. And she was involved in a lot of stuff, and basically they were trying to prove the use of depleted uranium. Now, these soldiers were not like the anti-war Vietnam vets. This was not, hey, they're on our side and they're anti-war. So okay, they're not our oppressors. We were living in the UK, but the idea that we would invite them to our house because we want to cooperate with them, but we are not going to absolve what we think they are, which is like kind of colonial soldiers who were committed in whatever language that we would use, but a colonial war, you know. And that was a type of dialogue that didn't seek to absolve the other or to convince the other. But it was an important kind of dialogue, because the idea was we needed their corporate, or my mom's group needed their cooperation. And then I was thinking, while I share 100% all the critiques of dialogue and Laura's experience, everything. And so understand the political urgency of critiquing it. I also think there's a political urgency of, okay, so I'm just thinking about like coalition work and like how we live in a time of like litmus tests and how we're going to exclude people from coalitions. And I know I've spoken a lot, so just the last thing on that, there's something that Maya Makdashi was saying about like, so let's say coalition work in Lebanon. You couldn't say, I'm not going to work with this person because they're not homophobic, because they're homophobic. And the people who do tend to say that are actually people who are trying to produce themselves as subjects in particular ways. And she calls these people white leftists, whether or not they're Lebanese or not, you know? And I thought that was really insightful, because actually often people who are most subjected to violence in Lebanon are not like middle-class queers, but like migrants and so on. And yeah, so I guess just the urgency of coalition work at a time of cancellation culture and litmus tests. Thanks.
Roseanne, would you like to speak?
Hello, Merhaba. Thank you so much for this. I'm wanting to ask like a bit more of a concrete question about something I've noticed, trying to kind of also put exigent sadism as like a read for what we've been noticing with student encampments, and then the after, the post of the exigent sadism. So part of the divesting from these attachments to the fantasies that have been placed and like kind of in those translations has been this bursting of saying like, fuck it, I don't really, it's not that I don't care, but that I am not willing to like sacrifice this kind of care to stay in an institution or have this degree if it means genocide or silence censorship around genocide. Now, what has happened since like quote the summer break, quote unquote, has begun is now I'm meeting with students that the encampment is over. And many are returning to either their home states or home countries. And there's this feeling of like deep, deep loss and disillusionment. And so I'm wondering, you know, because there's the life affirming kind of like the exhilaration or the revocation, as you've written previously, Avi, about of that form of like pushing against. And I'm wondering what happens in the after, because divesting can also become something that can, in the systems that run us, fall then to atomize again, kind of calibrate to that atomization. And I'm also wondering this because I'm Palestinian. And so I think and I've seen very different examples on the ground in Palestine of what communal living, especially in the wake of a lot of violence, looks like. At the same time, group psychology shows us that, you know, adhering to the norms of a group is very opposite to the exigent sadism. As an organizer and a therapist, I will be like, you have to have community. You have to establish community. It helps buffer that loss. So I'm having this tension of how do I understand those things? And not so much just theoretically, although I know that's going to be very useful. And I really appreciate you, Lara, like speaking to how, you know, Avi has kind of also encouraged that movement. But I really also want to know in practice, you know, what and how can I be present for that? So thank you so much.
So perhaps we should take these questions first. And what if we toggle between questions that are asked and then questions in the chat that may be read out loud? Okay, I see you nodding, Luke. Okay, let me take a stab at kind of like some of the things that have been asked. I'm going to start with the question of kind of like the fear. I mean, the fear is real. You know, I've heard people say to people in Lara's position and other people, and to me, like, oh, you do this without fear. And that is just not true. Kind of like the fear is always there. But the fear is not just about, like, there's the fear of what one might lose. There's the fear of how one might be seen. The fear is part of how this is operated. It's operated through the fear of, you know, we gave you this position. The implication is to what you're hearing, Joe, and you're not using it well. Maybe we'll take it away. Maybe your journal will lose its readership. And when kind of like a while back, I wrote a pretty intense critique of the Evans's book on gender dysphoria. And the editor of the journal received exactly the sorts of letters that you're describing. Why did you give it to her? This is not fair. This is not equitable. And I was lucky because the editor of the journal responded with saying, these are the reasons why she's a perfectly qualified reviewer. And we don't owe you like a review that includes both sides. And that was said very clearly. And that actually put us, I don't know how people who wrote the letters to the editor felt about it. I suspect they didn't like it, but it's very hard to overestimate how important of an impact this makes, not just for your author, but also for what it's like for people who are reading this exchange to see it. And to see an editor stand by kind of like that position. You're vulnerable because you're a candidate, but you also have a certain kind of power, and you have to decide how you're going to use it and what you're going to use it for. That doesn't happen without fear. I think it happens through fear. And for that reason, it's good to have like colleagues and comrades with whom you can have these conversations. But, and this I think connects to Razan's point, I think that, you know, very often when I've given talks about exigent sadism, I'm asked, But isn't this too individualizing? Like, doesn't this become too much about the interiority of the subject and kind of like self-sovereignty? Like, what about groups? And I actually have a pretty clear, through these questions, I've developed pretty clear thinking about this, which is that stepping into a collective struggle has to arise from the exercise of one's self-sovereignty. To step into a collective and to do so as an exercise of self-sovereignty means that, you know, everybody has to make a personal decision to participate. Like, you have to make a personal decision as to what you stand behind, what you're going to risk, what the dangers are, what the political commitments are. You make that decision, and then you join a group. If you join a group without that self-sovereignty, you're much more subject to kind of like what Freud described in mass psychology. You're much more likely to be caught in the excitement of the group and the effervescence of the group. And then that makes both the movement more vulnerable, and it also makes you more subject to feeling like, but did I really want to do this? Was I tricked into something? It makes you more likely to kind of like withdraw in fear. Like, I think that eventually, like, I think that for me, like a place of having, a place of kind of like entering this kind of, it's only through the coming together of individuals who are exercising their self-sovereignty that we can end up with collective reservoirs of refusal that are not cheaply run on the effervescence of affect, that are not just caught in the revolutionary moment, but which stand a chance to build principled and robust political solidarities. I think that without that, we're just left with a cheap exploitation of the erotic energies that bind us to social groups. And these can become vectors of adoration or devotion or attachment or even loyalty to some leaders, but may not necessarily provide the kind of sturdy collective work that is necessary.
Can I jump in? Because I was trying to keep my remarks short, so I didn't say what I think has been the most powerful thing I've learned from your work. Is that there's so you started off by talking about this is a psychopolitical concept. I was reading this old piece by Stathis Grigoris on sublimation and Castoriadis, where he says that Castoriadis always is to become a subject is to be in contact with the political. That's what it is to be human. So we're always, but from Castoriadis' point of view, we could do that in a way that's really lame and so stuck with the status quo and the instituted imaginary, or do it in a radically autonomous way, which is fueled by the unconscious and the id. It's so much like what you're talking about. It's so, and of course you know Castoriadis, but this is like kind of a different kind of sublimation that's not your old mama's one. And it's not a making nice. It's a radically transformative one. I think through these moments, to go back to the question you were just addressing, through these kinds of moments, we find our people. We find who our people really are. The people who are more committed to, and maybe I'm curious what you think of this language, a kind of sense of justice and imperative, the exigency, like, I can't not step back, or the quote from the professor who said, how could I, kind of job would I have? So that kind of exigency that comes from principle, commitment, whatever it comes from. But I think that, anyway, I just wanted to draw those together. I think that's part of the kind of project that you're doing, is what Castoriadis does, what Kristeva does, is that radical questioning. How would you?
I think that's a really interesting angle, Noelle. I hadn't thought of it in relation to Castoriadis this way. I see why you're bringing it together. And what you're saying makes me think of how, I think you're right, that through this you find your people. And kind of like, perhaps this is a different way of approaching Joe's question. Of course you're going to lose things, but part of the argument that I'm making around exigent sadism is that psychic energy is not as limited as we have been told it is. Like, when Freud gives us this notion of psychic energy, it's almost like you have 10 units, and if you leave like 2 units in the oral stage, you're going through life with 8 units, and then you're like more incapacitated. You know, these kinds of stories that start with a notion of like a stable amount of psychic energy apply only if you're not willing to risk yourself. If you're willing to risk yourself, if you're willing to be brought to a place of overwhelm, if you're willing to kind of like throw everything into the process, then psychic energy is renewable. And from that perspective, Joe, you may lose some people, but you're going to make others, and you're going to create other solidarities. And for anyone who is in a position where you're thinking, kind of like, what am I going to lose? Like, every time you lose, you also gain something else. So kind of like, I think that that's really important. So Noelle, that's a really good point. I'm going to take up also other people's questions, but I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in with things that have come up.
Oh, Lisa, you're
muted.
Okay, now I'm not muted. Okay, so I just wanted to just add a little bit to what Roseanne was saying. I really resonated with me, her description of, or their description of the sense of loss at the end of the semester, because you know, even though I have been ill, so I was not able to participate in a lot of the face-to-face stuff that was happening at NYU, but I followed it like religiously on Signal, and my friends were all the faculty and staff for justice in Palestine. I have friends there who kept me informed, and I was like all day reading the 1,000 Signal messages in the chat. And even being isolated as I was, there was a sense of community and connection and finding one's people on this campus that had not existed for the 30 years that I've been here ever before. It was really a profound sense of like people caring about what happens and sharing stuff in a way I had never seen before. And also that community was, for the first time, majority of color, many younger people, lots of queer trans. I mean, it was before the sort of radical groups on campus, the faculty democracy or the AAUP, or not radical groups, but the progressive groups on campus had been mainly white folks over 50 with a certain sort of 60s, 70s kind of vibe. And this was like this complete reconstitution of the understanding of the institution from the conditions of the genocide in Gaza that produced a sense of community that was really intense, even for someone who was isolated. And so I think that maintaining, because in the institutional rhythms, or of course the administration depends on this dissolving to some extent over the summer. And one of our tasks is to not let that happen, so that when the fall rolls around, those connections, that community maintains itself, that we put in the energy to reconstitute and re-energize after people have had a little bit of rest, and address all the things that are still going to be happening. I mean, there's still the disciplinary process of students is still ongoing. There's, the institution has done nothing asked of it. There's still so much to be done. But it is a tremendous sense of the pleasure and the gain of the exigent sadism is enormous. And the feeling of its potential loss has been then devastating. So I think it's really important to try to sustain that, because not only is the community energizing, it supplies psychic energy, but also a social movement is a university. It's the best university. And our students, from their teach-ins and all the libraries and everything they're learning more in those encampments than they do in the classroom. And it's really amazing. Everybody carrying books and inviting speakers and right to the encampments. It's its own university, and we want to keep that going if we can.
Can I just say something quickly, kind of tying in all these questions, maybe, is that there's also a way in which naming is really important here. And so I want to start with Razan's question about, I'm sort of thinking about Fanon naming a precondition to allow us to deconstruct the condition that creates the room for psychic suffering to begin with. And so when Razan asks us, how do we build tolerance to the losses and grief of exigent sadism, you're also drawing a connection to us and perhaps engaging and sort of forcing us to see that in the modality of the world we currently live, there is a let's say, a discrepancy or a misbalance in who carries the grief and who is constantly asked to adjust to that, and who is able to engage in, let's say, facile reparative moves at the expense of folks who have always been under the boot, right? And whether that's in the global South or in Palestine or anything. So I think I would invite here, and maybe this gets to Nada's question, and also to Joe's, is that for me, this exigent sadism is also a practice. It's a militant commitment. Because of all the seductions we're talking about, because of the ways in which power necessarily needs to stabilize itself, that is its job, is to stabilize itself, then we are also called upon to recommit. For me, and I love that Lisa sort of brought in an abolitionist, right? An abolitionist perspective, an abolitionist way of thinking about the world is never stagnant. It is always one that commits to undoing and doing and remaking and world making, precisely because we understand the pressures that are there to stabilize and how seductive those things can be. And so I would say that part of it, to Razan's question, is a radical redistribution of responsibility, right? Is that those of, and I think this is what Avgi is also calling us to, is that those of us who have, whether Joe's position or my position in APSA or other things, is that there is a way in which naming, we are doing this, and we're actually, in doing so, we're redistributing responsibility that otherwise falls on somebody else. There is no way around it, folks. If you don't, it's not like you get to stay in and nobody pays the price. There's a cost, and we're seeing who the cost is every single day, right? And I think that's part of it, is also being honest about if that's a decision that one makes, that still has a price, and somebody else is paying that price. So what does it mean to think about it in that way, and to make it become legible to us rather than just, just sort of hiding? Because, and this is where I kind of want to say just quickly, that we run the risk, and I've heard this a lot, and those of us who are clinicians in the room and in psychoanalysis can very much attest to this, that it then becomes enactment talk. And at some point, we have to reckon with the fact that things are not just enactments. They actually are material investments in power and social order and in the way that things are happening. And so to break that, one must also practice how one disrupts constantly the sort of traditional way of being. To Nada's point, I actually kind of want to push up against this idea that we're, number one, cancel culture. I don't believe in cancel culture. It doesn't work to anybody that doesn't have power. Nobody gets canceled except you're dispossessed already. And not in the ways that certainly I wish people in power actually would. But that's also, and I'm saying this here not as a pedantic way, but to reaffirm that part of making it legible is also saying what you are calling us to think about coalitional movements is actually happening right now with Palestine, right? And for us to miss that is actually a grave danger. To us to miss that in this moment, coalitional politics are actually happening precisely because the movement for Palestine is a movement against capitalism, imperialism, colonialism, transphobia, and for disability justice. And I hope we read the question about disability justice because it ties into the abolition. But here's why. So I get a photo from DC the other day. When you have a photo sent to you, when two people are standing on the street with signs that both of them say fags for Hamas, that blows everything out of the water, that we are not in a coalitional movement that actually is big enough and expansive enough to say, we understand the contradictions that lie within this. And in an abolitionist movement, we're dismantling the processes that cause the conditions for harm. And then we will continue to square up against these things, against these inherent contradictions, because that's the way that power also works, is make contradictions sort of smooth over. That's not what we're talking about. I think to say, actually, a lot of what I've been seeing is precisely what you're saying we should be doing. And that's part of the exigent sadism and why people are sort of melting the fuck down, because they're just like, what is it? What do you mean fags for Hamas? How do you even sort of think about this? I think that's precisely what we're talking about, is what are these ways in which we can reimagine a world that actually calls out those contradictions and says, I refuse to bend to the will of politesse, to the will of coercion, to all these sorts of things that have actually gotten us nowhere, and in fact get us in sort of campaigns of actual canceling when even thinking can no longer exist.
I think that for the same reason, like we see kind of like we can use as a kind of like as a diagnostic test almost where it is that the attacks are happening, so that kind of like where the kind of like coalitions are being pressured and where they are ostensibly like kind of like the fault lines that people are trying to like break them around. And, you know, I was also thinking about kind of like, in some ways, like exigent sadism tests our political commitments because it brings to the fore the distance between what we theorize or say we believe in and what it means to actually have skin in the game. And by speaking about having skin in the game, I don't want to kind of like equalize as if we all have the same skin in the game, or kind of like that in this case, for example, obviously Palestinians have kind of like literally skin in the game, kind of like the most horrific of ways. Kind of like, but I do want to say that anyone taking a stance becomes a possible target, and to put yourself in a place where you actually have skin in the game, where you could be hurt, where things could be taken away, is part of how kind of like this coalitional kind of like thing works. So, you know, that's something for everybody in positions of power, whether you're running a journal, whether you're running a group, whether you're supervising, whatever impact you have in the field, to have in mind. I also did want to go back to the question that Naira asked about kind of like the absenting of the sexual. I am not saying that every time that the sexual is not there, kind of like you end up with an obstructed discourse. What I was trying to speak to is specifically the way in which the consideration of the sexual has been resisted within Holocaust discourse. And that obviously that is not 100% accurate. Otherwise, we wouldn't have people like Fogelman and Waxman writing their work. But it is not part of the mainstream rendering. Like when you think about, for example, when you think about kind of like the antebellum South, you're also thinking as part of the dominant narrative of kind of like slaves, kind of like enslaved people getting violated, the questions of consent around that. These are things that kind of like a lot of scholars have been writing about. We don't have those kinds of narratives in thinking about the Holocaust. There are places where those are not foregrounded, but like it's not the same thing as having kind of like the suppression. Also, I wanted to say about different types of dialogue and different types of repair if we have different types of sadism. I'm not thinking like we should throw out repair and nobody should talk to anybody ever, or that kind of like the notion of the reparative is kind of like, I mean, I guess we could think about what it means to take the reparative seriously as repair. But what I am trying to say is that even our reflexive attitude but can't we save it? Do we have to give up all of it? Should alert us to the anxieties that this kind of like comes up, that the anxieties that it brings up in us, to have that even kind of like contested. As for kind of like your point, Razan, around kind of like the loneliness and the loss, like one way to think about that is kind of like what happens over the summer is that people kind of like regenerate also their energies, so that kind of like the loneliness of it can come back as a force in the fall, which is kind of our hope.
Just wanted to come in. We've got lots of questions in the chat. I just wanted to read a couple of those. So this is from V. I'm trying to make psychoanalytico-political sense of activists refusing to mask in public spaces in solidarity with disabled and chronically ill people. The moralistic arguments, as per usual, fail again, and any appeal to ego and to at least protect yourself from long COVID seems to fail against a certain sexy danger of not masking. I know there is a lot of purposeful government propaganda, but it seems relevant to uses of exigent sadism in community. This is from Carmen. It seems that exigent sadism is conceptualized primarily as a response to neoliberal capitalist institutions with a specific focus on emotional divestment and refusal. In addition, it can powerfully speak about why feelings cannot be fought with facts. My question is whether exigent sadism can also offer a different response to the fantasy of returning to a time before trauma that we see reflected in the growing attraction of the right. Why would Trump voters listen to exigent sadists? What would make them listen? How are these two responses to neoliberalism different, e.g. ethics of vulnerability, concept of care and risk, and what might connect them? I'm not sure, but maybe one way to recuperate sadism from its negativity might be found in an answer to this set of questions. This is from Julie. I'm interested in the neurobiological and energetic human experience that for me is where the embodiment of processing trauma without traumatizing others becomes possible. In particular, the experience of processing disgust, including moral disgust. Dysregulated disgust can become a dominant submissive reactivity, which can go into acting out or somatization. Discovering how inner boundaries and internal authority connects with our capacity response, for me this is sovereignty, means we can meet the other in similarity and difference without trauma reenactment.
Well, I have something to say about the engagement of the Trump voter question, I'll say briefly, and that is that I do not think there, as Avgi said also, that there is any way to persuade or engage in discourse with supporters of the right wing. I think the only way to meet that challenge is to build the community and institutions and sources of solidarity and excitement that counter it and give and offer other avenues out of harm and out of trauma. The right has built a lot of institutions. So the right, and it starting with the right wing, the conservative churches, but also there are economic networks. There are a lot of them are multi-level marketing and like all kinds of networks where people make a living by joining the right wing. There's a blog by the son of one of the leaders of, I think it's is it the Proud Boys, or I don't remember which one it is, but he wrote this blog saying basically his father would change his narrative at rallies depending on how much money he raised from that. He was able to raise from that speech. But it's not only, it's the sale of merch at large rallies. There's a whole networks of people making a living by joining the right wing, people who are otherwise, unattached to sources of employment. There are also these sources like the giant rallies and there's lots of these sort of scenes and sites and institutions and practices that allow people to connect and make a living in a way that the left, not liberals, but the left has not really met that challenge, has not really built. We used to be unions used to have a kind of, infrastructure of community support and building, but the unions have been so decimated that that's not really a much of a source of community and solidarity. But when I remember watching the big teacher strikes, right, a couple of years ago, and the amount of mass excitement and pleasure with those scenes of the teacher strike in Los Angeles, the teacher strike in Chicago, then the nurses started striking. And in each case, they were striking for their own well-being, but they were also striking for the good of their students and the good of their patients. And it was producing, expanding the structures of the union movement, but expanding them in a way that was not, business unionism, that was really about the support of life, right? And building structures for life. And I think that doing that is the only way to counter. Getting in an argument, having a debate, getting into a back and forth, trying to persuade, I think is completely a hopeless endeavor. And Avgi is right. It's not just the mainstream liberals. It's like we're very attached to that as a practice, right? At thinking, well, what we have to do is argue. What we have to do is persuade, when actually what we need to do is build sources of excitement, connection, community, and sources of material support, ways of materially supporting each other and collectively that appeal, that draw people in who otherwise, are finding that they can make a living and find community on the right.
I mean, I'll jump in and say that I completely agree with you, Lisa, and to add that kind of like there's also a way in which, like in trying to, there's a long political tradition and long political tradition, political philosophy, and kind of like believing in the capacity to kind of like running a demos by thinking about like wooing the other, kind of like convincing the other through rational arguments. So kind of like aside from the psychoanalytic angle, there's a lot of history in political thinking about kind of like that puts a lot of faith in that. But to me, and here I'll go again back to thinking psychoanalytically, this is not just ineffective because not everybody's interested in having those conversations, and because you can't talk people out of their feelings or all of their libidinal investments. I think it's also a manifestation of our own resistance to engaging with some of the excitement that you were describing, Lisa, because that excitement is both generative and it also can make people anxious. So I'm thinking of how difficult it can be sometimes even to be engaged in something that is exciting, or to be reading something that kind of like really makes everything flare up and your mind goes a mile a minute, and then you want to kind of like slow things down. So I think that our own anxieties about this escalation, like the sexual drive works on the principle of escalation, and we can think about that. Somebody asked about scale in the Q&A. We can think about that also in the context of the sexual drive wants escalation. The sexual drive wants more and more, but that's kind of like that can also be kind of like anxiety provoking and generate its own resistances in us. That's why I'm so kind of like focused on thinking also about self-sovereignty, that kind of like you can't ride the wave only of a group. Otherwise, you very quickly are going to end up in a group that you may have a more ambivalent relationship with, rather than feeling that you're also kind of like signing on to it all the time. And I also wanted to say something more about Carmen's question about the time before trauma, because it reminds me of what you were saying, Lisa, and what Noel has also been writing about in terms of the fear of breakdown. I think it's absolutely the case that trauma is a category that has, I would say, whiteness built into it, in the sense that it encourages a kind of imaginary where some subjects are untraumatized or deserve to be are unbroken and deserve to be unbreakable. And when they are broken, then repair is in order. So, for example, we see this kind of like in the rise of like right-wing nationalism, kind of like white supremacy. The idea that if a white person feels upset, then the world needs to stop and fix that, because a white person should not be feeling upset, right? So, kind of like I think that this way of thinking about Lisa, you're muted.
Another term for that is like outraged entitlement.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very connected to this idea of kind of like trauma as something that needs to be kind of like repaired. So the time before trauma, kind of like there is no, while there is the before to a traumatic event, a traumatic moment, there is no before to a traumatized subject. That is not to level all kinds of traumatizations and say they're equivalent, but it is to say that this fantasy that there are subjects that are not traumatized and can live outside of the circumstances of difficulty is kind of like part of how white supremacy works. And I'm not so sure about recuperating sadism from negativity. I'm thinking of kind of like how queer negativity has given us so much to think with. So I want to think about that more in relation to your question, Carmen.
Can I quickly just jump in around the disability justice piece? And I don't know if it's Vi or V, so I apologize for mispronouncing your name, but I think there's something really important, and perhaps this is the place of pressure that Avgi is asking us to push up against, that, you know, our question or discipline of world making must include, if we're thinking about an aesthetic of revolution, perhaps aesthetic of revolution has to also include these questions. And the reason why I'm saying about location is that part of what's been so mesmerizing and sort of encompassing and also really important politically about the aesthetics of revolution in the context of the United States is that most of these folks we are seeing are masking. But what's amazing also is a reimagining of the kufiye and the sort of fidai idea of masking, and to understand how masking is also a way to engage in a politics of abolition. That abolition also includes us sort of, again, moving beyond the comforts of this everyday and sort of including what type of world free of this sort of coercive domination are we imagining us living in? And so it is about, yes, dismantling prisons, but it's also about how we relate to one another, right? And about the coerciveness that might be involved in relationship. I think what Avgi is sort of asking us to do is at least be honest about those moments, like what is happening here, to sort of think about what are the psychic elements that might be at play when somebody might not be willing to take that extra step, let's say. I think this is where I learn alongside disability justice activists when they talk about Palestine also as a disability justice aspect, particularly for these reasons, about movement, about access, about who's there, who we imagine in those spaces, right? And who we already push out in those ways. But I think that playfulness, that idea of like, oh, okay, this fidai sort of wrapping also is part of how I'm including my thinking about liberationist worlds, right? And it is really important also to think about it as a way to disrupt the state's claim on violence, which Avgi also talks to us about, because we understand that this has become masking, has become a way the state has seen that it's actually being disruptive, which is why we have New York now, the New York governor, trying to impose a ban against masks, right? So if there's anything that shows us how these things get interlinked, and a re-invitation for us to be thinking in these ways, in these links, in these pressure points, that I think for me, that's what Avgi's work really does best, is to think around these pressure points and in terms of the libidinal energies that are always overlapping in these spaces. And for me, if we do that, then there's a way in which disability justice can't be but part of this conversation. It's always an interesting question to be like, when does it not? When is it not, and why?
There's a hand up, Ariel.
Yeah, so I think I can maybe articulate this a little bit better than I tried to in the chat. So like my friend George here, I work as like a intimacy educator, sex educator, and I think one of the kind of the applications thinking through one of the things that's interesting thinking through exigent sadism is the way that there's this like maybe like a structural alignment between the position of the analyst and the position of the sadist in this kind of maybe important dimension, which is that like you have this ethical obligation not to overdetermine the experience and not to overcode what's happening, to kind of give people room to kind of interpret as they will. You're creating the situation of overload, you're creating this, of overwhelm rather, you're overloading things, you're supersaturating things, you're creating this moment of rupture, and then something will align and will crystallize out of that, and maybe this thing will be more joyous and like be more amenable to the flourishing of the person, right? Or maybe it won't. And there will be another moment where there can be another unbinding and like another reconfiguration, right? But like something really important in that entire process is that you're not over-determining or foreclosing or directing on things too much. And maybe something is afforded, maybe that like kind of relating is afforded by like the specific structural whatever of like the clinic or of like where the sexual relationship in this kind of like sex education thing is taking place. So I kind of have a question of like, this is like maybe another scale question, right? Which is like, I feel like that kind of openness to kind of what might emerge, not really wanting to like overdetermine or know what might emerge, right? Like, how does that apply to different domains? And part of what I'm thinking about this is I feel like one of sort of the big struggles of the activism and the organizing I've been around is like, there are definitely things in spaces that you don't want to happen, especially around Palestine organizing, watching as time and time again, spaces that have, I think, important and good radical political commitments end up with this kind of bad, like liberal, maybe like progressivist co-optation of what's happening. And I feel like a lot of work of sort of like holding open those spaces is maybe preventing a certain kind of foreclosure, but that also requires like a different kind of like structuring and foreclosure and like denial that feels very structurally different to me
Yeah.
than sort of the posture that you would need to take as sort of the exigent sadist in a relationship curating an encounter, or as an analyst.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of curious about the difference in scale there, and how these things transfer.
I do think that there are some differences. I'll say something about this and hopefully it touches on what you're asking. I think that's where the question of dispossession comes in. Like, there are different things that kind of like, and different responsibilities and different roles in the consulting room, as opposed to kind of like when we're thinking about kind of like the social world. Exigent sadism is not about, it's not about not having preferences, as not having ideals, not having commitments, not having things you want to see happen in the world. Where dispossession comes in is in recognizing that you actually cannot will that over others. I don't think that you can convince them, but that doesn't mean that you have no impact. You can convince them, I think, through rational argument. But I do think that kind of like part of what the exigently sadistic stance opens up to or makes possible is a certain kind of confrontation, a certain kind of contestation, including the idea that that relationships are not to be taken for granted. Like, people leave relationships, people decide that they don't want to be in this space or another space, people resign from institutes, people decide to not train, people decide all kinds of things. And kind of like, and that is one way of kind of like embodying an exigently sadistic stance. The institution may still not care. They may be happy you're gone. They may be happy to like just take somebody else in your stead, which embodies a similarly diverse kind of like position, so that they feel their diversity quota. Like, kind of like, so when I talk, like, this is not a method for like making change in the world. Like, the world still has to somehow engage, and they get to choose whether they do that or not. But what I am trying to say is that, like, there's ways in which we have imagined that we always have to do that from within, or that we have to stay there, or that new kinds of coalitions cannot be built in the act of leaving. And that's what I'm trying to push up against. I also wanted to say, I've been thinking a lot about the masking question, about the question of disability, as kind of like the conversation is unfolding, and thinking also about kind of like it's a place where coalitional politics often break down. Kind of like, I've seen this in a lot of protests, in a lot of spaces, and I wonder if kind of like I was talking earlier about having like skin in the game, and what it means for some people to kind of like side with the kind of like wanting to hold on to kind of like their body's invulnerability, and not wanting to be touched or moved by the idea that our bodies are all vulnerable in different ways and will become more vulnerable with time, and whether that's one way of resisting that kind of disturbance in oneself. So kind of like I know of kind of like I have friends who create spaces that are masked only, and I think that this is a really interesting way of doing exigent sadism, saying this is what this space is, and these are its parameters.
I just a very, very brief add-on to that. I remember, like, in the same day, getting the announcement about the governor of New York trying to moving to ban masks on the subway, which is unbelievable. And on the same day, getting an announcement of the New York City Dyke March, in which it explained that there would be wheelchairs available, there would be interpreters available, there would be guides for the vision impaired available, that there would be, that they had a whole array of accommodations so that people could participate in the march. And it was, the contrast to the two emails between what Lara is talking about, and that's actually making that part of your vision of justice is that kind of disability accommodation, which is just universal access. It's not accommodation of a special population. It's making an accessible left, right? As opposed to this like insane attempt to prevent activists from being able to hide their identities by making everyone immunocompromised people such as myself unable to ride the subway. Like, yeah, one day in the life of New York City.
Brendan writes, I think repair could have a similar multi-sidedness as sublimation here, and exigent sadism is likewise bound to be victim to irony. White fragility was originally understood to be precisely an exigent sadist work, rather than a work of solipsistic repair. It quickly became otherwise. This is from Tracy. I'm thinking about the ways in which identification with the aggressor, coddling the powerful, might also be seen as an acceptable form of sadism, but one that is hard to grasp and see. Exigent sadism, it seems to me, makes itself palpable and visible. George writes, I have a question that might be rather technical in its nature. I'm not a psychologist, but an independent intimacy researcher, familiar with your and Laplanche's writings. You're talking about exigent sadism as well as the exigent sadist. Is it a narrative abbreviation to not distinguish between a practice and something like an identity, or not conscious? Reading your work, Avgi, and listening to today's talk, I would think that the form of sadism that you call exigent, and which I feel very drawn to because of its opaqueness, is rather a practice or an event, almost entered through an act of decision rather than stumbling into it. Another question that I may add is with regards to repair. How would you compare this notion with Derrida's forgiveness that is never actually possible? Only that can be forgiven that cannot be forgiven.
Okay, I'm going to say very quickly, indeed, I would say yes, the identification with the aggressor versus exigent, I think, yes, the sadist makes themselves known, but for me, it's less about the, I think the exigent sadist needs to know it in themselves before they do anything else, that it's a commitment. It's a decision to kind of step into something and take certain forms of risk. As for forgiveness, I think, I mean, that's a really big question that I've been thinking about a lot as I'm working on my chapter on exigent sadism. But what I would say relatively quickly is that kind of like forgiveness requires kind of like, obviously it's not an undoing of the harm, but it requires somebody who's actually interested in acknowledging the harm and is willing to do some work on themselves so that forgiveness is actual, or whatever word you use for this, is actually substantive and not just performative.
Thank you so much, Avgi, for this really vital intervention, and to all our respondents and to all our participants. There have been lots of questions about the recording. We'll make it available in the coming days on YouTube, and I'll send it by email as well. Thank you.
Thank you to the Red Clinic, and thanks to my conversationalists. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, all of you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Melanie.